I lifted my hand, and the two golems walked into the forest like they had been waiting years for the excuse. They were carved from whole trunks, taller than any man, twice his height and more, the joints cut clean, and the runework burned deep into the wood so my will could run down through it. They took the tree line apart. One swept an arm, and a young tree came down whole, roots and all. The other set both hands to the earth and dragged a road open where there had never been a road, hauling the dirt back in long black furrows. Branches cracked like bone. Birds went up in a scatter and screamed at me for it, and I stood at the edge of my new country and watched it take its first wound, and I thought, good. Something out here should bleed besides me. Behind me, Matilda watched the dark between the trunks, still as a held breath, one hand resting near the knife at her hip. Behind her, the horse-shaped golem stood patient in the traces of a small cart, everything I owned in the world stacked on its boards. A tent, a sack of seed, a crate of books, a little coin my father had counted out like he was paying for a stain to be scrubbed off his floor. I gave the forest a smile it couldn't see the back of. So this is where we live now, I said. Dreams as far as the eye can see. I could be sick. I'm so happy. Isn't that right, Matilda? She knew me too well to smile at that. Exactly as you say, Lord Adrian, she answered, and kept her eyes on the trees. 3 months earlier, I had stood in a very different room and heard a very different verdict. My father did not waste much on me. He never had. He had been my father the way a man is the owner of a horse he never rides, the name on the papers, and nothing under it. He summoned me the way you summon a clerk. He told me, in that careful voice men use when they want a cruelty to sound like a gift, that I was his blood after all, and so he would give me something. A barony, Ashford, a scrap of detached land the crown had handed his house generations back, and no one had ever once wanted. Develop it or leave it to rot, he said, and he made very sure I understood he would never think about it, or about me, again. I understood exactly what the land was. It was a grave with a title carved on the headstone. He was handing me somewhere to die that would not cost him the shame of killing me himself. So I thanked him. I have always been good at thanking the people I mean to bury. And then I asked him for the one thing in that whole cold house that I actually wanted. I asked to take Matilda with me into my own household as mine, to free her and give her a place at my side. He looked at her the way he looked at everything he had already stopped valuing, and he waved it away. Do what I liked with the rabbit woman. It cost him nothing, so he gave it easily. It was the best trade I ever made with my father, and the beautiful part was that he never even knew a trade had happened. The why of it went back further than that haul. My mother had been a maid once, a poor and a clever one. Clever in the way that ruins people. She let a rumor of a child spread through the estate until the count had to own me or lose face, and it worked. She traded me for soft rooms and a concubine's comforts, and the moment she had them, she had no more use for the boy who had bought them. She never once loved me. She died of a fever when I was 9, and what I felt, watching them carry her out, was mostly a cold and quiet arithmetic. The one wall between me and my father's contempt had just come down. He walled me off inside the month, a separate annex behind the main house. One boy, 6 years, no family, no visitors, only servants who looked at the concubine's brat like something the rain had washed in under the door. They left me books because books were beneath their notice, and that was their one mistake. I read all of them, histories, ledgers, and buried in the pile, the puppet texts, the theory of golems, the burning of the patterns, the trick of running a living will down through dead wood until the wood stood up and obeyed. Nobody thought to take that from me. Nobody imagined a caged boy could make anything of it. I made 2. Most who carry the talent at all manage a single golem and sweat to hold even that. I ran 2 at once, easily, the way you'd walk holding a cup in each hand. And it never once occurred to me that this was supposed to be difficult. I made them plow and haul and build, work that was meant for a whole crew of paid men. And I did it in a locked room where no one was watching and no one could take it from me. And I told not one living soul. A boy with nothing in his hand learns fast to keep the one card that matters turned face down. And I had already worked out that a lord who commands a labor army no one else can see is a lord who can build a country out of empty ground. So, no. Standing at that tree line, I did not intend to lie down and die on my father's charity to spite him. And I did not intend to crawl the long road home and beg. I intended something slower and much worse for him than either. I intended to build a life out here so far past anything he owned that the size of the difference would sit on his chest for the rest of his days. That was the whole of my plan. Everything after, it was only work. The work very nearly killed me before the forest got the chance. My body was a joke, and I knew it. 6 years shut in a single room does that to a person. Half a mile into my own territory, and my legs simply quit. I had to sit on a raw stump and breathe like a man 3 times my age while the golems went on swinging without me, tireless, not needing my lungs at all. Matilda came and crouched down in front of me and offered me her back, as plainly as she'd offer to carry a pack. Lord Adrian, if you would like it, I can carry you the rest of the way. On the first day, in my own country, I got my feet back under me one at a time. No, I walk into this place on my own legs, or I don't deserve to hold it. She didn't argue with that. She simply rose and fell in a step behind me and to the right, where she could keep both the trees and my back inside her eyes at once, and we went on into the dark of it together. We found the river near dusk, clear water running down out of the northwest, cold enough to ache the teeth. I put the camp on the north bank, up on ground a spring flood couldn't reach, a flat open patch the golems could widen, and widen it they did. What a crew of grown men would have sweated over for a week. My 2 golems opened in a single evening. They flattened the earth, felled the trees that crowded the bank, and stood the tent poles upright while Matilda and I ran the canvas out between them. When it was done, I stood in the middle of a raw square of cleared ground that had been forest that same morning, the first flat land in the whole territory, mine, because I had made it out of nothing but wood and will. And the golems were not even tired, because they do not tire. They would still be swinging at dawn, and the dawn after that. That was the whole secret of the thing my father thought he had thrown away. I had not been sent into the wilderness alone. I had been sent in with an army that ate nothing, slept never, and worked while I dreamed. Before I let either of us rest, I strung the alarm. Cords run tree to tree in a ring around the camp, hung with iron rods that would clatter and wake us if anything large came feeling its way through the dark. Matilda watched me not the last of it and said nothing, but I caught the look on her. "You think I'm being too careful," I said. Her ears tipped, the way they did when she was choosing honesty over comfort. "I think you always expect the worst, Lord Adrian. I've been right about that every day of my life so far." I pulled the cord tight and tied it off. "The morning I'm finally wrong, I'll be glad to owe you the apology." She made tea after that. Water boiled fast over a heating rod set with a blue-purple magic stone, and we ate hard bread and dried meat sitting on the cartboards with the fire between us. "A lord who lives in a tent," I said, and found I half meant the joke, that against all sense it was, in fact, kind of fun. When I finally slept, she stayed up. I woke once in the night and saw her sitting near the flap, with her ears turned out toward the black, guarding a boy who owned nothing in the world but a tent, 2 golems, and her. I did not yet understand how much that last one was worth. I was about to. She had not always been mine to guard. She was born a long way south in Lodmark to tenant farmers with 8 children and bread enough for maybe 6. When she was still small, they sold her. A single gold coin, one less mouth at the table. No goodbye that she ever remembered. And the south of that country kept nothing gentle in it for beast folk. To the people who bought her cheap and worked her to the bone, a rabbit-eared girl was a thing you could strike when the day had gone against you, and the days went against them often. So she learned young. She learned not to weep where it could be seen, and not to hope where a hope could be taken away from her. For years, by her own quiet account of it, she was alive in the body and dead in every place that counted. Then they sent her north, and they handed her to the one soul in the whole house who ranked lower than she did. The concubine's forgotten son, walled off from the family. They meant it as an insult aimed at both of us at once. I remember the day they brought her to my door. She had a bruise coming up dark along one cheek, and she stood the way a person stands when they are only waiting to be hit again. I was a boy, and I did not have the grand words for what moved in me, so I reached up and touched the mark on her face and said the one true thing I owned. "That looks like it hurts," I told her. "You poor thing." Nobody had ever said a thing like that to her. I only learned that much later, and when I did, it made me want to break something in that house. I taught her with what they'd left me, letters, numbers, and then, out of a battered martial arts manual, I bought off a board guard with the last of my coin. I taught her to fight. The whole of it reworked for a body faster and stronger than mine would ever grow to be. I told myself it was only sensible. The truth was plainer and harder on my pride than that. She was the single warm thing in a cold house, and I could not stomach the thought of her ever being helpless in it again. So when my father cast me out and I asked for her, and he flicked her away like lint off a sleeve, understand what I was really doing. I was not freeing a servant. I was bringing away the one person in the world who had ever chosen me, because years before, she had been the one person I chose. She woke before me in the new tent, the way she always did. I surfaced slowly out of sleep to the smell of barley going soft in milk over the fire, and to her voice pitched low so it wouldn't pull me up too fast. "Good morning, Lord Adrian," she said, and I heard the small, careful happiness under it, the kind she only ever let me hear. Whatever we were setting out to build on that riverbank, we were building it 2 thrown-away people deep, and I would have staked the whole barony on her before I'd have staked a copper on any highborn lord I ever stood in a room with. The land was supposed to be worthless. I decided to test that on the second morning. I set the golems to break ground, 2 wooden giants leaning into plows, dragging them through soil no blade had ever cut, opening a black field about 5 paces by 5 out of the raw forest floor. Matilda watched them work it and told me I seemed to know a great deal about dirt. I gave her the honest version. I knew what a book had told me about dirt, and today we would find out together whether the book had lied. Then we planted potatoes. I had bought the seed pieces before I ever left my father's county. A strange choice here, a curiosity, an ornamental oddment in this kingdom. Their buds just showing green. But far to the south, across the sea, they don't call it a curiosity. They call the potato the savior crop. It grows in poor ground. It grows quickly, and it fills empty bellies. If I was going to gamble a whole life on land everyone had written off as trash, I wanted a crop that specialized in proving people wrong. We pressed the seed into the first field Ashford had ever owned, the 2 of us down on our knees in the cold dirt side by side. And for a little while out there, nobody was above anybody and nobody was below. With the field seeded, I set the golems back to felling to push the clearing wider, and Matilda's ears came up. She heard it long before I saw a thing. Her whole body changed in a breath. The quiet, careful woman was simply gone, and something coiled and ready stood where she had been. "Lord Adrian," she said, low and fast, "something is coming. A monster, one of the small ones." It came out of the brush at a dead run. A gluttony rabbit, near as long as a man is tall, all hind legs and teeth, the kind of always hungry that eats root and flesh, and anything on the ground slower than it is. She asked me for it, not begging, asking, the level way a craftsman asks for the tool she has trained her whole life on. "If it's not too much for you," I started. She was already gone. She met the thing head on. It lunged. She was not where it lunged. One turn, low and impossibly quick, and the iron blade fixed to the toe of her combat shoe came around and drove clean through the rabbit's skull in a single stroke. It dropped into the churned dirt, and it did not get back up. The whole fight was over faster than it takes to tell you about it, and she came up out of it breathing hard and bright-eyed, standing over her first real kill like she couldn't quite believe the world had let her win one. I crossed the field to her and set my hand on her head, and I meant every word of it. "You're my pride, Matilda. Well done. Truly, if I lost you out here, I'd be in real trouble." She went red all the way to the tips of her ears and started to stammer, undone by the praise in a way no monster on this earth could have managed. Then, because one of us had to stay practical, she reminded me we still had a carcass to bleed and dress before the meat turned. That pulled a laugh out of me, the first real one in that forest. The land my father had handed me to die on had a road cut into it, a fortified camp on its river, a field turned and planted, and its first monster dead before noon of the second day. Not a bad start for a grave. Somewhere far to the south, a count was already hard at work forgetting he had ever had an elder son. I intended to remind him, "Not soon. I can wait. Patience is the one thing in that house nobody ever thought to lock away from me." But one day, with a whole life built up out of the nothing he threw me into, raised high enough that he would not be able to look anywhere without seeing it. For now, though, there was work. Out here, there was always work. I picked the tools back up and went to it, and behind me, the golems kept swinging, and the forest, for the first time since we came, gave a little ground. The coins went down on the counter one at a time, and Eliza counted them without looking at me, which I appreciated. 200 crowns for 3 weeks of food. She called me the Forest Baron when I came in, half a joke, half a title, and I let her keep both. By then, it was routine. A month of clearing land behind us, the golems felling trees while Matilda and I widened the fields, and every so often, the stores ran thin, and we made the half-day walk to town. The guards at the gate waved us through now. The stairs in the street I ignored, and Matilda walked at my back like the whispering was beneath her, which it was. Anna brought tea, while her brother Marco loaded the cart. She had her mother's sharp eyes, and none of her mother's patience for pretending, and she watched me the way a person watches a door they are thinking about walking through. You could keep your books if you can read them, I said. She could, she told me, well enough to run an inventory. I filed that away and said nothing, because a girl with numbers in her head was worth more than most of what I could buy in that shop, and I could not afford her yet. Eliza saw us out and told me, only half teasing, that I should give up the forest and move my whole operation to Redwick. I laughed and said I'd think about it. I would not, but the joke sat wrong on the walk to the gate, because it touched the thing I could not solve. I had land. I had golems that never tired. What I did not have was people, and no one in their right mind moves their family onto monster forest with nothing but tents to sleep under. I had started with 300,000 crowns. After the expedition, the tools, the seed, the golems, I was under 150,000 and dropping. A manor would eat that in a season, and an empty manor draws no one. I turned it over the whole way out of town and got nowhere with it. The forest swallowed the road a mile past the gate. The horse golem hauled the loaded cart behind us, patient as ever, and the 2 labor golems walked out ahead where I could see them. Matilda kept glancing at me. She had noticed my mood. I'm sorry, she said. My ignorance keeps me from thinking of any clever plan. It isn't your job to be clever. It's mine. I meant it kindly. She dipped her head anyway, the way she did when she felt she'd fallen short of something no one had asked of her. We at least needed a house of our own, I told her. A real one. Somewhere to start. She offered, carefully, like she thought I'd already dismissed it, that we could hire the craftsman out of Redwick to raise a manor. I was doing the arithmetic on that and finding it ugly when her ears snapped upright. She turned toward the tree line. Too late. Something came out of the brush behind me fast, and then there was a body against my back and a cold line laid flat against my throat. Easy now, a voice said, low, close to my ear. Don't move. Don't you move. Matilda's hand went to her knife, and the arm across my chest tightened, and the man told her flatly that if she wanted her keeper to keep breathing, she would stand still. Here is the part people never believe. I command more than 1 golem at a time, 2 swinging as easy as 1, which is rare enough that I keep it a face-down card, and in that moment, it was worthless. A wood golem is tall and slow to arrive, and the blade was already resting on my skin. Send one lunging, and the only thing that opens is my own throat. So I held still, and I made my hands loose, and I started counting the men instead. 3 at first. The one at my back, broad and scarred, plainly the leader. A lean one who stepped in and searched me with the bored efficiency of a man who had done it 100 times, and came up with my coin purse. A third came for Matilda with a rope. She caught him full in the face with a kick. I heard the wet crunch of his nose from where I stood, and he staggered, cursed, and came on again anyway. 2 more of them drifted out of the trees. Then a man and a woman, and against 5, she could not both fight and keep me alive. The leader reminded her of that. She let them bind her wrists. Her eyes never left me the whole time, and I have rarely felt worse about anything. They stripped the food off the cart. They took the purse. Then the leader hauled me up and told Matilda they'd release me down the road unharmed. Follow, and I died instead. He was lying, but I didn't know that yet. What I knew was that the moment they marched me off, she screamed my name once and then again until the trees ate the sound of it. They walked me a good while before they stopped, in a hollow where the light came in sideways and gold. I was 15 and could not have beaten any one of them arm to arm, let alone 5. So I did the only thing I have ever been good at. I talked. I asked what they wanted. Money, I offered. They already had my purse, but a frightened noble offering more money is exactly what a frightened noble is supposed to do, and I wanted them comfortable. The leader let me talk. Then he told me, almost gently, that the promise to free me had been a lie. His band freed their hostages as a rule. Nobles were the exception. Nobles, they killed. I asked why. I was stalling, and I let it sound like stalling. A boy buying seconds. But part of me wanted the answer, and the answer was the whole story. They had been a mercenary company once. A real one, decent-sized. A count in the south had hired them for the war against the Palace Empire, and then spent them like a man spends someone else's coin, thrown at the worst of it, held in place to die so his own troops wouldn't have to. The leader got what was left of his men out alive and westward, and out here, banditry was the only trade that would still have them. That was why they hated nobles. A noble had looked at 100 living men and seen firewood. I already knew the shape of the story. I had lived the other half of it. This is a long shot, I said, slow. But the count who hired you and threw you away, was his name Maximilian? Count Maximilian of Vance? The hollow went very quiet. The lean one's head came up. The woman glanced at the leader. Nobody had to answer. Their faces answered, and I felt the fear drain out of me and something colder pour in to take its place. I have been told my smile is unpleasant when I stop guarding it. I stopped guarding it. I see, I said. I see. So he got you too. The leader wanted to know what a noble brat found so funny with a knife near his throat. So I told him, not cleverly. I didn't have the room to be clever, and for once, I didn't want it. I told him I was that same count's son, a concubine's child, born inconvenient, that when my mother died, he'd had me shut in a walled-off corner of his estate for 6 years, the way you store a thing you mean to forget you own, and that when I turned 15, he'd handed me a scrap of coin and a patch of monster forest, and sent me off to die quietly, where no one would have to watch. So, we're the same, I said. He looked at me and saw firewood too. The only difference is, he threw me away slower. The leader had gone still. I could see it landing, the thing he'd been carrying alone all these years. The private conviction that his ruin was his own to bear, sitting suddenly in the hands of a 15-year-old who'd been ruined by the exact same man. It rearranges a person. That. I watched it rearrange him. He asked me, rough, what a boy like that even wanted. Revenge? Yes, I told him, but not the kind he was thinking of. I didn't want to burn my father's house down. I wanted to build a life so much happier and so much more full of love than anything that cold man would ever hold. And I wanted him to live long enough to know it, and to know he had thrown it away with his own 2 hands. That was the revenge. To win by being the thing he could not be. For a long moment, nobody in that hollow moved. I could see him weighing it. Not whether I was telling the truth. He'd decided that already, but whether a man who'd spent 2 years teaching himself to hate everything with a title could set the hate down without falling over. His men watched him and said nothing. It was his call and they all knew it. Then the leader let out a breath, and something in his shoulders came down that had probably been up for years. He said his own anger felt small next to what I'd just laid out. A grown man's grudge beside a boy's whole strange dream. He got it now, he said. I was no spoiled noble brat, and he wasn't going to kill me. I could have stopped there, walked home alive, counted it a good day. Instead, I looked at 5 ruined people my father had made, standing in a forest with nowhere left to go, and I saw the answer to the problem I'd been chewing on since Redwick. Then come with me, I said. I have land, empty land, and it's legally mine. Mine to give. I can't offer you much yet. Tents, hard work, a start. But I can offer you a place that's yours, and a lord who will never once look at you and see firewood. Swear to me, and I swear back, I'll cherish you the rest of my life. I held his eyes. And if I ever become a lord not worth following, cut me down. The leader looked at me for a long time. Then he told me his name, Roland, and he knelt and set the point of his blade to the dirt and swore it the old way, the warrior's way. His 4 fell in behind him. The sword that strikes my enemies, he called himself. The shield that guards me, his loyalty, mine. I had walked into that forest a hostage. I was walking out of it with an army of 5 and the first people in the world who were mine because they chose to be. That was the moment a bush at the clearing's edge exploded, and Matilda came through it screaming and kicked the man with the broken nose square in the face a second time. She had cut her ropes with a wood chip and run the whole way, and she arrived to find her captors kneeling to me, which stopped her about as hard as a wall would have. I caught her before she took a 3rd swing at Radley, who was sitting up with blood down his chin and taking the whole thing with more grace than I'd have managed. These men are not enemies anymore, I told her. They're my father's victims, like us. She didn't like it. She said so. She feared for me. She couldn't trust them yet, and she planted herself between me and the 5 of them, ready to keep fighting a battle that was already over. Roland heard the distrust and answered it the way an old soldier does. He offered to prove himself by taking off a finger, an ear, if a finger wasn't enough. You'll do no such thing, I said, and stepped on the idea before he could reach for a blade. I already trusted his loyalty. What I did not trust was his manners, because he'd called Matilda that she-rabbit back on the road, like she was a nuisance, and not the reason he'd nearly lost his hostage. So I kicked him, twice, unhurried, while he knelt there and let me. Then I told him, and all of them, plainly, she is my Matilda. You do not insult her, not once, not ever. I looked around the hollow to be sure it landed. Is that understood? It was understood, and Matilda, who had braced herself for me to hand her past over to strangers, looked at me instead, and gave the smallest smile I had seen on her in weeks. I brought them home the long way in the dark, and I watched their faces when the trees opened onto it. There wasn't much to see. A patch of cleared ground, 2 tents, fields of turned soil with the first potato shoots coming up in rows, stacked timber, the golems standing idle at the edge like tall, silent sentries. To a stranger, it was almost nothing. I told them the truth about it anyway, that there were no houses yet, that tomorrow I'd buy them tents in Redwick, that everything past this clearing was still just a plan in my head. I did not dress it up. A man who's been sold a lie once can smell a second one coming, and I wanted these 5 to believe me for the rest of their lives, which meant I could never start by flattering them. Roland looked at the little field of shoots for a while. Then he looked at the forest all around it, endless and dark and waiting to be turned into something. He didn't say anything, but he stopped looking at it like a place to hide and started looking at it like a place to build. That was enough. We ate around the fire that night, bread and dried meat, and whatever I could pass around, which wasn't a feast but was shared, and shared is what mattered. Roland went down the line and gave me his people by name. Percy, the lean one who'd taken my purse so neatly. Bart, easy and grinning, already at home. May, sharp-eyed, watching me the way you'd watch a card that had turned over into something better than expected. Then, Roland told me a thing that made the whole ambush worth it. He could speak into a person's mind across distance, not to everyone at once, one man at a time, and only someone he'd met face-to-face first and only out to a few miles. He offered it up almost apologetically, like a small and useless trick. I did not think it was small at all. A domain with no roads and no walls, lives or dies on how fast word travels across it, and I had just been handed a voice that jumped miles in a heartbeat. I told him it was worth more to me than any blade in the circle. He seemed surprised to be worth something. I was getting used to seeing that look on the faces of people my father had thrown away. It caught up with Matilda in the tent, after the fire, when there was no one left to be brave in front of. She held on to me, and she came apart. She'd thought she would never see me again, she said into my shoulder. She'd been powerless, bound in the dirt while they marched me off, and she asked me to forgive her for it, as if any of it had been hers to stop. There was nothing to forgive, and I told her so. I told her the ropes weren't her failure, they were mine, for walking that road with one guard and no plan. And I told her the other thing too, the plain one, because she needed to hear it, and I was tired of only ever thinking it. I love you, Matilda. She went still against me. I'll never let myself be taken from you again, I said. I promise you that. She didn't answer right away. She just held on tighter, and after a while, her breathing evened out. And outside the tent, 5 people who had tried to kill me that afternoon slept in my camp as if they'd always been meant to. I lay awake a while longer, doing the arithmetic that never turned off. This morning, I'd had 2 tents and a money problem. Tonight, I had 6 sworn people, a voice that could cross miles, and a household beginning to take shape around a fire in the middle of my father's idea of a grave. Not bad for a grave, not bad at all. The morning after I turned 6 bandits into 6 retainers, I put them in a field. 2 of my golems were already at work, wood giants twice a man's height, tireless, tearing roots and folding black earth where forest had stood a week before. Roland stood in the furrow behind them with a planting stake and a grievance about his back. 20 years since he'd farmed, he said, and his spine remembered every one of them. I told him the field was his, not to work as a tenant, to own, freehold, his name on it. Taxes to me and nothing else. He went quiet. Men do that when you hand them the thing they'd stopped letting themselves want. Then he bent back to the dirt and planted like the ground owed him money. I meant to make them retainers in the end, not farmers. But a man plants harder in soil he owns, and I needed the soil planted. Both things could be true. Most of the useful ones are. We ran the cart to Redwick every few days after that. Food, cloth, soap, tents, the small dull necessities that turn a camp into a place people are willing to sleep. My new men had a talent I hadn't paid for. Set them in front of a kind shopkeeper, and they became 3 pitiful drifters the good Baron had rescued out of charity. Eliza fed them extra on the strength of it. I didn't correct her. A story that useful is a kind of stock, and I don't spend stock I can hold. The forest paid in more than potatoes. Monster hides, dried meat, magic stones, all of it worth coin to the right house. And I'd picked the right house on purpose. There were bigger buyers in Redwick who'd have shaved me thin and smiled doing it. I wanted the one with a name to protect. When the head of the company came out to greet me himself, I knew I'd chosen well. A man that size doesn't leave his office for a baron who owns a forest and 30 crowns of hope. He came out because he'd already decided I was worth being early to. Benedict Miles was heavyset and easy and sharp as a filleting knife under the warmth. He looked at a plump deer hide and 8 rabbit pelts and a handful of magic stones and offered me 5,800 crowns. a shade over what I'd hoped. "I'd like this to be the first of many, Baron," he said, and put out his hand. I took it. Roland, behind me, said afterward that I'd worn the same lazy face through the whole thing and called me a liar for it because he'd watched my jaw the whole time and knew I'd been nervous. He wasn't wrong. It was the first real money the territory had ever made. I just don't let a man across a table see the size of a thing to me. That's the one price I never pay. 3 months in, the ground gave back its first crop, and I made a ceremony of it because I wanted one. I dug the potatoes out with my hands like a child pulling treasure from mud, 7, 8 to a plant, more than I had any right to. Roland told me to hurry up and stop laughing so we could actually eat them. We boiled them that night and grilled rabbit alongside, and 7 of us sat around a fire in the middle of what my father had handed me as a grave. They were warm and dense, and filling in a way I'd never felt from food before. Nobody spoke for a while. You forget, when you've been hungry, the careful hungry of a caged childhood, that a full belly is a kind of argument. Proof the land will keep you. Proof the verdict was wrong. Matilda said it was a day that would go into the history of the territory. She meant it plainly, the way she means everything, and I let it stand because she was right. South of us, the forest thinned to a killing ground, where 2 kingdoms rubbed their borders raw, and somewhere down there, the Lancel army was turning villages to smoke. I didn't have the name for it yet. I'd get it soon, from a man who walked north out of the fire and lived. But that night I was warm, and my people were fed, and I let the war stay a rumor a little longer. Then, Redwick had a problem, and Redwick's Viscount decided it was mine. 24 refugees had walked up out of the southern conflict and sat down at his south gate. Too many to feed forever, too dangerous to turn loose into banditry. So Arnold sent for me. He was cordial about it. He'd already told the refugees my name before he'd told me theirs, which meant he'd built me a small debt and hoped I'd walk into it grateful. I didn't. I thanked him for a chance that helped us both, and I declined the debt, which annoyed him, and, I think, impressed him in equal measure. He was the kind of neighbor who tests a young lord the way you test ice. One boot, watching for the crack. I let him find it solid and told him nothing. Behind me, Matilda stood still as a closed door, one hand near her knife, reading the room for me while I read the man. He thought he was handing off a burden. He was handing me 24 people who would remember, for the rest of their lives, who took them in. They came at me in a rush when I reached the gate. Hope moves fast when it's been starved. And Matilda put herself between us until I raised a hand and slowed the whole thing to a breath. A man stepped out of them to speak for the rest. Edgar, late 20s, careful bearing, the manners of someone taught by a father who'd expected better days. He told me where they'd come from without decorating it. 50-some had fled the border when the Lancel soldiers came. 24 were still walking. His own father, the village chief, had stayed behind to buy them the road and hadn't followed. He said it level, and only his voice betrayed him, right at the end, on the word father. I told him his father had bought something worth the price, and that my land could hold them, and that I welcomed them as my people. Not charity. I was careful to say it that way. A new life, and work to earn it. He knelt. Some of them wept. I filed the war away where the smell of the smoke could reach it and thought, this is what it looks like, coming north. It would come further. I meant to be ready when it did. Back home, I gave them land, not tenancy. Land, cleared, black, ready ground, carved with Edgar into 11 households and handed over free. To a refugee who owns nothing, who has been turned from every gate between here and the fire. Being handed his own soil is a thing that goes into him like strong drink. Grown men stood in their plots and cried and called it theirs, over and over, as if saying it might make it stop being true. Roland watched them and told Matilda, lo, that I'd already won every heart in the clearing, and probably knew it. She'd worked it out by then, that I'd been counting this from the day the 2 of us first walked into the trees. She didn't seem troubled. If anything, the arithmetic made her adore me more, which I've never entirely understood, but have learned not to argue with. So let me be honest, since no one at the fire would be honest for me, I gave that land away because empty ground cost me nothing and bought me devotion, and devotion is the cheapest army a poor man can raise. It was kindness. It was also a ledger. I looked at those people, and I did not see firewood to be spent and thrown away slower, the way a certain count had looked at me, and that, it turns out, is a thing men will follow you into anything for. Both true. I told you the useful ones always are. By full dark, the clearing had a well, and a bread oven, and a leveled road, and more backs bending in it than I'd ever fed at once. And every night, I did the same sum, and every night, it came up short. Winter was coming. I had timber and golems and grateful hands, and not enough coin to put a roof over any of it before the cold. I needed money out of the ground, so I went looking for some. The Redstone Mountains sat at my northern edge, and mountains in the north keep secrets worth digging for. I wanted to go myself. Roland and Edgar looked at my thin frame and my talent for tiring, and, between them, talked me out of it, kindly, which is worse. So Roland took a team of 5 and went without me, and reported through the voice he can put straight into my head across the miles, twice a day, until the range swallowed the range of it and left me listening to nothing. 2 days of nothing. Then he came back early, faster than the schedule, and one of his big men set a wrapped bundle down in the middle of the clearing, and every soul in the settlement drifted toward it without being called. Roland cut the cloth back. It was blue. Not painted blue, not dyed. Blue all the way through. A slab of raw stone taller across than a man is wide and heavier than one man could lift. The deep bruised blue of deep water with flecks of gold, caught trembling inside it, like the whole thing had swallowed a night sky and kept it. It smelled faintly of struck matches. It looked like something that shouldn't be sitting in the dirt of a barony everyone had written off as worthless. I knew it. I knew it from a childhood spent staring at things my cold mother paraded to prove she'd married up, and from books read alone in a shed because there was nothing else to hold. Lapis lazuli, raw. Ground to powder, it becomes a blue pigment the rich fight over, worth weight for weight, more than gold. I stood over it a long moment and let the size of it land. My father had handed me this ground as a joke, as a grave, and the grave had opened up and put a fortune in my hands. Somebody asked how much the chunk was worth. I told them we wouldn't be worrying about money for a while, and I heard my own voice come out steady, and underneath it, something in me was laughing and would not stop. A fortune you can't price is a fortune you can be robbed of. So before I sold a single stone, I lied. I dressed down to a modestly well-off nobody, walked into a Redwick jeweler alone, and asked to buy a gift for a lady. The man showed me sapphire, an opal, and, when I steered him, a lapis necklace at 800 crowns, and told me, helpfully, having no idea he was arming his own robber, that raw lapis ran 2,000 a kilo and more. I apologized to him in my head for the deceit. Then I walked out, knowing exactly what my mountain was worth, which is the only footing I ever agreed to negotiate from. Then I put the same blue slab on Benedict's table and watched a very controlled man forget to control his face. He offered me exclusivity's price, and I haggled him up, and we shook on 1,200 crowns a kilo, a ton a month, a year of it. The 50 kilos I'd carried in walked me out near 60,000 crowns, richer than I'd walked in. Here is the part he couldn't work out. I sold him the stone raw. Raw stone is the low margin. The real money is in grinding it to pigment, and I handed that money away on purpose. Because I had no craftsmen, yes, but mostly because a tiny barony that suddenly runs a great glittering business is a lamb that has learned to ring a dinner bell. Let the grinding and the getting rich happen in the Viscount's territory. Off his tax rolls into mine, and my dangerous neighbor has every reason to want me prospering and no reason to want me gone. I took less coin to buy something I valued more. I bought the right to be small and safe and quietly, enormously funded, all at once. Benedict figured out that much later, alone in his office, and told his man that my easy smile was the most guarded thing he'd ever traded across. He kept dealing with me anyway. The profit was too good, and that too was the point. There was one more mouth to close before I could dig. I went back to Arnold and asked, plainly, only for a mining teacher. Not his men, not his crew, a teacher. He worked out at once that I'd struck something in the mountains, and I watched him start to reach for it, some quiet way to slide his own hands onto my vein. So I told him, easily, that I'd already signed the whole raw supply to the Miles Company. That closed his hand on air. To squeeze me now would be to cross the biggest trade house in his own territory, over a barony that was routing wealth straight into his coffers. He gave me my engineer and decided, out loud and to my face, that I was better kept as a friend. I agreed with him warmly. We both knew what the warmth was worth. The engineer came, a broad, taciturn dwarf named Victor, with an apprentice and a hired hand at his back. He taught my people to hold a mountain up with timber so it wouldn't come down on their heads, and then the blue stone started coming out of the dark by the ton. Over 1,000,000 crowns a month. I spent the very first month of it, all of it, in a single afternoon. The entire sum poured into a construction contract, houses for every household before the first frost. Partly because they needed roofs. Partly because a poor lord sitting on a heap of coin is a story that draws thieves and nobler thieves both. And a lord who has spent everything on his people is only a story that draws loyalty. Coin can be stolen in a night. You cannot steal a village of houses. The frames went up faster than the foreman had promised, because I lent him every idol back and every idle golem I had. My own manor got built first. The settlers voted it so, and I let them, because a lord's house is a thing people like to point at. I walked the fields at the end of it. Edgar met me in the rows, grinning, and told me the potatoes were coming in fast and fine, that it was like a dream a crop like this existed. I told him I hoped to see it fed to the whole kingdom one day. I kept the rest to myself, that a crop that cheap and that filling was also the surest wall a poor territory could raise against a hungry winter and a coming war. 6 months before, my father had thrown me into a hole to die in. I stood in the middle of it now, a thriving field, a mine that paid, a road, a well, roofs going up against the colt, and every day more of the discarded walking north to be mine. The land everyone had called worthless was already the best bet in the region. The verdict was already wrong, and I hadn't even started answering the man who'd made it. The manor went up by the middle of autumn, and the first thing I did was walk Matilda through every room to prove the walls were real. 2 floors, brick walls thick as my arm, a working wing on one side and a living wing on the other. Nothing lavish. I had spent 6 years in a shed with walls a draft could walk through. I wanted walls a winter couldn't. After years of tents, I said, knocking a knuckle against the brick. This is almost indecent. She told me it was splendid, Lord Adrian, and went a little pink when I grinned at her for it. Roland's house went up first of all the rest, a shade bigger than the others, because a chief retainer should have somewhere to be proud of. He came back from the mines to see it with May, and the two of them stood in the doorway like the frame might vanish if they blinked. I reminded him he'd once sworn to strike me down if I ever turned into a bad lord. He said the promise was void now. I told him to keep it anyway, then left them their doorway and walked home. The problem that grew out of all that success was a stupid one. The territory was expanding faster than one man could keep books for, and I was falling asleep at my own desk over ledgers nobody else could read. So I went to Redwick and asked Eliza, over a counter stacked with winterflower, whether she knew anyone literate willing to move to a frontier village. She didn't. Literate people had good work in town. Only a fool traded that for the edge of a monster forest. I was already turning to go when her daughter spoke up. Anna, green-haired and quick-eyed and braver than her nerves let on, asked whether the offer could be hers. I let myself look surprised. I wasn't. I had spent weeks at that counter talking up the pioneer life where she could hear it, because I'd noticed the way she listened. Both things were true. I did need a clerk, and I had steered the girl who wanted to be one straight into my lap. Most of the useful things are true twice over. Her mother hauled her into the back to argue it out. I waited, then offered terms so generous that refusing was the only foolish answer left. A trial, then a squireship, a room, a house of her own if she married. They took it. Anna proved herself inside a week. She rebuilt my ledgers and laid out a labor rotation cleaner than anything I'd managed, and I made her a retainer of Ashford on the spot. She cried. I let her. The war in the West kept coughing people up onto my road. One family arrived claiming they'd fled a Lonsel raid. Under a few plain questions, the story bent, then broke. A farmer named Russell, his wife, and his daughter Lily run off from a Marcus whose taxes would have starved them. Fugitives, in plain terms. I could have turned them back. There was nothing in keeping liars, except there was. Hands for the fields, a family with every reason to be loyal, and a Marquise too far south to come asking. So I told Russell I'd take his honesty over his story, warned him to keep the word fugitive out of his mouth inside my walls, and gave them a house. It was mercy. It was also a ledger. I had stopped pretending those two things lived in different rooms. By first frost, the count of us had crossed 50. The houses were roofed, the firewood stacked. We shut the territory up tight and waited for the winter. We had started holding a meeting once a month, now that there were enough of us to need one. Mining, patrols, farms, the money, everyone reporting in turn. I sat at the head of a table in a house I'd built and thought about how far a shed was from here. Then I asked whether anyone had anything else, and Matilda raised her hand, which she never did. The settlement had no name, she said. It was a village now, more than 50 souls, and a village should have a name. I agreed. Good idea. Then she said the name should be Adria, after me. I actually put a hand up. Hold on, that's too much. I could hear how it sounded, a place with my own name stamped on it. It's embarrassing, I said, which was the honest and useless truth of it. Nobody let me off. Percy called it perfect. Radley called it fine. Anna pointed out that Redwick itself was named for its first lord, so there was precedent, and looked delighted to know it. Roland only said that the moment Matilda spoke the name, there hadn't been a better one left to find. He didn't stop there. He said, plainly, in front of all of them, that I had given people with no future a place to stand, and that they wanted my name on the map. because they wanted the map to remember whose idea they were. I have been called a great many things to my face. That one I had no answer for, so I said the name was accepted and that I would try to be a lord worth putting on a signpost, and I let them see I meant it. We rolled the whole thing into one festival, the naming and 4 weddings, every couple who'd married that year. I bought a fat deer and more drink than was wise, and the square filled with people who 9 months back had been bandits, refugees, and a boy nobody wanted. Roland called for quiet. He told them these were the words of their lord, then stepped back and left me the fire. I don't remember all of what I said. I remember telling them this was our starting line and not our finish, that a year ago, this had been a tent and a scratched out field, and that everything passed that we had raised with our own hands. Somewhere in the middle, my voice tried to go, and I got it back, and I lifted a cup to 4 couples instead of finishing the sentence. It was easier than admitting the forest had grown a home while I wasn't watching for it. Later, May asked Matilda why she stayed only at my side and never asked to be my wife. Matilda's answer reached me secondhand, the way the important things do. She said the prejudice against her kind would only weigh me down, and that she was already standing in the happiest place she knew. I had promised her once that I would keep her beside me for life, whatever noble I one day married. She had decided that was enough. I decided I would spend the rest of it proving she'd bet right. Winter should have been quiet, and nearly was. Then Radley came in off patrol with blood on his mind. He'd found a pack of goblins in the shallow wood torn apart by something far bigger, fur snagged on the bark, prints too deep for anything small. An orc out of the deep forest, driven up to the edge by a hibernation that had failed it, hungry and close. I called everyone in that night. The arithmetic was ugly. My handful of former mercenaries couldn't be sure of an orc, and the farmers would freeze solid at the sight of one. 10 trained men, Roland said. Or a mage. I told them I'd go myself, and take my golems. Roland warned me a winter forest with an orc in it was no place for the lord to play. I heard the cold come into my own voice when I answered, that a lord too frightened of one beast to spend his own power on it wasn't worth the title, and that I would sooner risk the 2 things I'd carved out of a tree than one person who had chosen to follow me. They caught the edge in it and grinned, the way they did whenever the pleasant part of me stepped aside for the other part. I let them. It was useful. The plan was almost insultingly simple. Radley was the bait. My golems were the fists. Everyone else stood guard and stayed out of the way. I waited under a shared cloak with Matilda at my back, keeping the cold off me. I'll admit the north still beat me half to death every winter. Then a whistling arrow told us Radley had one, and he came through the trees at a dead sprint with the thing behind him. 2 full meters of enraged pig muscle swinging a log like a club. The first golem met it head on, and the orc caught the blow on the wood and held, which it had no business doing. For half a breath, I understood exactly how men died out here. Then I brought the second golem in from behind, where the orc had forgotten it had a back, and ended it in a single strike. Nobody spoke for a moment. May said quietly that she had never seen a golem drop an orc head on like that, and that it was unreal. Good. Better they think it unreal, and never count how many I could move at once. We dressed the beast and hauled it home. The hide and the magic stone were mine. The meat went to everyone. Late that winter, the whole village stood around a barbecue in the square, greasy and laughing. And for once, I let myself be simply cold and full and pleased. Spring opened the roads and the immigrants came in a flood, my rumor having done its work. I handed the first family's houses and fields as they arrived, because a settled family turns into labor overnight, and labor was the whole game. Word reached me of a peddler I was fairly sure reported to the Viscount next door, and I let him keep coming. A spy you can see is cheaper than one you can't. The trouble arrived on 2 legs. A newcomer named Brenner had been shoving his way through the settlement, petty theft and threats, and cutting in wherever he pleased. Then he cornered Matilda in a back alley to rob her, and she put him on the ground without taking a single mark. I got there fast. She apologized, of all things, for the trouble. I told her the only thing that mattered was that she was unhurt, and I stood at her side where the whole crowd could watch me do it. Brenner sneered that it was nothing, only roughing up a lord's beast servant, barely a crime at all. The rotten old common law half agreed with him. A first offense against a beastfolk ward bought only 10 lashes. I gave him the 10, and the next morning, in front of everyone, I made a new law. Harm to any of my people, my companions first among them, would be judged as harshly as harm to any citizen alive. My people are not firewood to be spent cheaper than the rest. I would not run a territory that priced them that way. The law didn't reach him. Days Days later, Percy caught him robbing a farmer's daughter at knife point, a blade at her ribs and her purse already in his fist. I ordered him exiled and set out with Percy and a golem to walk him to the border and be rid of him clean. He wouldn't go clean. On the road, he told me exactly what he would do once he was free. Spread it to every town that Adria was a rotten little place run by a coward and come back, when I wasn't looking, to make my settlers pay for the walk. He meant it. Exile wasn't sending him away. It was aiming him at other people and handing him a reason. I remember how quietly the decision came. That was the part that frightened me. There was a cold thing in me, the same thing that had smiled in the meeting room, and it looked at Brenner and did the arithmetic without once flinching. I turned off the road into the trees. I gave the order. It was over in the space of a breath, and I did not watch, and the forest would take what was left. Then I was sick in the brush like the boy I still half was. Percy gripped my shoulder and said everyone is shaken the first time, that you never forget your first. He was right. I haven't. That night, I told Matilda the truth the village would never hear. She said she wished she could have carried it in my place, and that nothing about me had changed in her eyes. I let her keep the second part, but I had felt how easy it was, and I had a father who found that kind of ease natural, and for a long while after I sat in the dark, asking the only question that mattered, whether the grave he dug for me had left some of himself in my hands. I decided I would carry the weight rather than set it down. A man who sets it down stops feeling it, and I never wanted to stop feeling it. We finished a bathhouse by the river that spring, the sort of thing cities have and villages only dream of, and the settlement took to it like proof they had arrived. The retainers soaked and argued over who would marry next. Radley had gotten himself engaged, and Percy was loudly aggrieved to be the last man standing. My own bath was a smaller, private thing I'd budgeted for out of pure selfishness. I sank into it that evening with Matilda sitting near and let the heat pull the winter and the road out of me. Warm and quiet, I told her. This is close to heaven. She said she was glad I could rest easy. I was resting. I meant it. But under the heat, where it had moved in to stay, was the cold I had found on that road. Patient, useful, mine. A home with my name on it, and a chill underneath it keeping watch. Both things were true. Most of the useful ones are. Benedict poured the good tea before I had sat down. That is the tell of a man who owes you more than he is comfortable with, and the Lapis contract had made him owe me a great deal. I had come to collect the soybeans I ordered, live plants packed in barrels of soil, hauled across half a continent because the north cannot grow olives, and I was tired of candles that stank of rendered fat. I meant to press oil from the beans. If it worked, it would move through his company. I let him hear that part plainly and watched the sum settle in his eyes. Then I asked for the smaller thing, and he braced as though I had drawn a blade. A labor broker. My territory had outgrown its own hands. The baths, the mill, the new fields. All of it starving for bodies. Benedict had been steeling himself for something far heavier, and the relief loosened his whole face when the request proved light. He gave me the name of the best recruitment house in the Conley Viscountcy and thanked me for the custom. It was a fair trade. Most of the useful ones are. 2 weeks later, Percy brought word that the broker's party had reached the gate, and by the time I walked out to meet them, the whole village had turned it into a fair. More than 15 workers stood in the plaza, and my people circled them the way a hungry house circles a laden table. They were young and sound, and far too many of them for a quiet frontier. The war in the West was spitting out anyone with 2 good hands, and I was standing where they landed. I took on more than 15 for wages. One of them the broker set apart with a careful question first, because the man was beast folk, and he wanted to know if that troubled me. It did not. He was a tiger of some chieftain line, broad as a door, and when he gave his name, it came out low and level. My name is Zane, my lord. I made him foreman over the field crews before the day was out. Matilda watched him the way she watches everyone new, then stopped watching, which is her verdict. Across the plaza, the retainers were claiming farm couples and strong backs, better than 30 souls in all by the end of it. My barony had been a place people were sent to die. Now brokers brought them here to live. I did not let the size of that show on my face. The last hire came out of a closed carriage, and she came out furious. Blue hair with a thread of gold in it, a graduate of the higher schools, the ruined daughter of a merchant house that had once been richer than half the lesser nobles. Bankruptcy had folded her into a bonded work contract to settle the family's debt, and I bought that contract down to a fair price and took it on, because an educated hand is rarer on the frontier than gold, and Anna was drowning in ledgers alone. I gave the girl a room in the manor and went to explain the work. She would not let me finish. She told me to keep my distance, told me she was never meant to be bound, demanded her release, as if I had stolen it rather than paid for it. Matilda offered very quietly to set her straight. I declined. I told the girl the plain shape of it. Her contract was for the ledgers and the accounts, nothing more. Prove herself worth the ink, and I would forget the tantrum. Fail, and there was always the field and the mine. Christy called it backwater bookkeeping and swore she would not be beaten by it, which, I noted, was at least a yes. It would do for a start. The new hands solved everything the new hands were meant to solve. The baths ran daily now instead of once a week. The mill ground the farmer's wheat for no fee because tax already paid for it. And out in the fields, Zane worked his crew like a man paying off a debt only he could see. He told me once that we treated them better than they had ever dared hope, and that when a man is given that much, he wants to work himself to the bone to earn it. I have built my whole territory on that exact arithmetic. Christy solved nothing. She was brilliant with the accounts and poison with the people, snapping at Anna, sneering at the maids, calling Matilda a lowly servant to her face. Anna brought me the weekly report and, when I asked, the weekly complaint. She said it with a tired half laugh now, the same girl who a year ago would have flinched at the whole business. Matilda asked, not for the first time, whether she should simply be rid of the problem the way we were rid of Brenner. I told her no. Christy would not hurt anyone for gain. She only could not stand where she had landed, and a person like that you cannot break into shape. You can only wait out. Besides, the village had helped pay to bring her in. She was mine now, and I do not spend my own people cheaper than firewood, not even the ones who make me want to. It was kindness. It was also a ledger. Both were true. A maid left a latch undone, and pride did the rest. Christy went out her window in the dark with bread and a few keepsakes in a cloth bag, over the low fence on stacked crates, out past the fields and onto the road. Certain to her bones, she was better off gone. The wild did not care what she had once been. She caught her foot in a rut and went down hard, the ankle turning under her so she could not run. And while she sat there in the dirt, something came out of the brush that was not a pursuer, a goblin. Crude club, claws, and a girl with nothing but her arms to raise. We were already coming. The alarm had gone up the moment the maid found the empty room, and I had ridden out with Radley the instant I heard, tracking her by the open window and the trampled fence. I came into that clearing at a dead run with her name in my throat and saw the thing standing over her. Radley, now! He stepped past me and put it down in a single stroke, and it did not get up. I did not slow to watch. I was already on my knees in the mud with her, my hands finding the wounds on her arm and her cheek, telling her it was over. She was safe. Nobody was leaving her out here. She grabbed my sleeve with both bloodied hands and came apart. Every scrap of the pride was gone. She sobbed that she could not do it, that she would go back, that she would work and be honest and be respectful, that she was sorry. Please, do not send her away. She begged for the one thing she had spent weeks throwing in my face, a place. Matilda was already kneeling to bind the arm. Percy stood over us with his blade up, watching the tree line. I wiped the dirt from Christy's face and told her the truth, quietly, because it had always been true. Of course you have a place with us. You always did. Rest now. She went limp against me, somewhere on the road home, finally believing it. She slept the better part of a day. When she woke, she ate the porridge the maid brought her and thanked the girl for it, and the maid came out looking as though she had seen a ghost do something kind. It was Matilda who finished what the road began, and she told me of it after, plainly, the way she tells me everything. She had sat with Christy and given her the one thing she never gives to strangers, her own past. Born with nothing, sold before she was old enough to understand the word, mistreated for years until a boy took her in and taught her letters and freed her. And she told Christy about that boy, about the years he spent locked away by his own blood, and then handed a stretch of killing forest with almost nothing, and how he built a village out of it inside a year. The difference, Matilda said she had told her, was never ability. Christy had ability to spare. The difference was the will to look at a hard place honestly and build in it anyway, instead of drowning. Christy wept and apologized, and pledged herself to Matilda, to Anna, to the barony, to me. I heard all of it in my office with a relief I did not bother to hide from the two of them. Then I said the part that was mine to carry. I should have seen how close to the edge she stood. A lord who does not watch his own people is only halfway a lord, and I would not let it get that far with anyone again. I thanked Matilda. Sharing that had cost her something, and I knew it. A fever took me flat for a few days that spring, a childhood illness, of all the undignified things, and Matilda nursed me through it and did not once let me pretend I was fine. When I was upright again, Bart brought me a folded blueprint. He had picked it up off a workshop floor in Redwick, dropped by a young smith, mid-shouting match with his master over a weapon that would change how wars were fought. Bart had spent time on a battlefield once. It got his attention. It got mine. 2 weeks later, I walked into that workshop myself. The master went pale, trying to talk me out of wasting my afternoon on a dreamer, then fetched him anyway. Damien came out scruffy and listless, a man used to being told his ideas were noise, right up until he understood I had come to listen. Then he lit like a struck forge. "You call it what?" I asked. "A crossbow." He talked me through it fast and half mad with excitement. A bow laid sideways on a wooden stock, a trigger to loose it, no years of training in the arm because the mechanism held the draw. Matilda slid between us when he lunged forward with the prototype and eased back when I raised a hand. I kept my face polite. Inside, I was already doing the sum. 150 people, most of whom had never held a bow, and every one of them an archer in a week. A small barony cannot outmuscle an army. It can outthink one. I offered him a workshop and a budget on the spot. "You are actually going to fund this?" He asked it like a man braced to be laughed at. He was not laughed at. Within the week, he had quit the smithy and hauled his tools and his prototype to Adria, and the first thing he did after I showed him his room was run off toward the workshop without waiting for me to finish the sentence. I told the maids to make sure he ate and slept. Talent comes with its dents. I have never minded the dents. The engines I had planted all came ripe together. Christy brought me the potatoes first. A dozen trial plots run under different hands of fertilizer and water, and out of them a clean set of rules. Strip the buds properly, feed the soil twice, mound the earth. Real farming guidelines, the kind you could carry past my borders and teach. She glowed telling me, and I had to remind the girl who once refused to lift a pen not to work herself into the ground. She promised she would rest. Her well-being, she said, was part of my household too. She had learned my own arithmetic and turned it back on me. Then Damien burst in with the 4th crossbow and would not be still until it was tested. So we walked it down to the river range and put it in Roland's hands. Roland loosed a dozen bolts, grunting, and gave his verdict like the soldier he is. Accuracy much better, seat the bolt a touch narrower, but the string was too stiff even for his arm, and the frame started to fail after a score of shots. Damien spun to run off and fix all of it at once. I caught him by the collar and told him if he collapsed, the crossbow stopped with him, and I would cut his budget to nothing before I let him die at a workbench. He promised to come home every single night. I almost believed him. It was coming. Not finished, but coming. And the family kept pairing off into permanence, which is the only wealth I have never had to defend at a wall. Edgar took Anna to Redwick to stand before her mother and brother and name their marriage, and by his own account, he nearly wept at their table when they told the orphaned farm boy he was family now. Bart, of all the reformed rogues, was undone by a bowl of stew. A waitress named Michelle had ladled it out in some Redwick restaurant, and the taste of it dropped him straight back into the church kitchen that raised him. She had noticed him lonely and quietly added lentils to make him smile. He proposed. She said yes. He brought her home through my gate, and I signed her into the barony in about the time it takes to say congratulations. Percy watched the last of the old mercenary band get married off and sulked at me that the world was unfair, that a man who used to chase flashy women had landed a gentle one while he had landed nothing. I offered to announce a wife hunt for him. He found that more insulting than the loneliness. I stood in the square while the lamps came up and let myself feel it. A settlement that was nearly a city, an armory taking shape by the river, a table of discarded people who had chosen to be mine. The warmth was real. So was the cold I had carried home from that road with Brenner, still awake underneath, still keeping its patient watch. Both were true. I had stopped expecting either one to cancel the other. Somewhere south of all this light, though I did not know it yet, a man with 200 blades at his back was being pointed toward my walls. The 100th bolt punched into the target, and the frame did not crack. Roland lowered the crossbow and worked the mechanism twice, checking it over. No split in the wood, no pins gone loose. The string still sat true. Percy had fired his 100 before him. Radley his 100 before that. 3 men, 300 shots through one weapon, and it had held all the way. No faults left in it, Roland said. You can trust it in a real fight. That was the one thing I had been waiting to hear. Then it's finished, I told them. It's a weapon now. Well done, Damien. Damien made a sound I can only call a shriek. He'd been crouched at the edge of the range, chewing his thumbnail through the whole test, and the word finished set him off like a struck bell. He jumped, he yelled, he grabbed the nearest crossbow and hugged it. Radley flinched. A maid dropped a laundry basket back at the manor and looked our way. Matilda, standing at my shoulder, laid her ears flat against the noise and gave me a look that asked, plainly, whether we truly needed him this loud. We did. That was the trouble. Damien was the only man alive who knew how to build the thing start to finish. I put my worst problem to him standing right there in the mud. I want more of them, I said. As many as your hands can make before the snow. Bolts by the 1,000. I'll put my own workers under you to speed it. He was still glowing when I walked back toward the house. A boy of 16 with a mine, a full larder, and now a weapon that turned any farmer into a marksman. It should have felt like the top of a hill. Instead, the cold I'd carried home from the road with Brenner stirred under all of it and would not lie quiet, the way it never quite did now, as if it knew something the rest of me hadn't been told yet. It was right. It usually was. Philip brought the first thread of it, and Bart pulled the rest loose. There was a bandit host in the South, real soldiers once, beaten in the Western War, and turned to robbery when the crown spent them and forgot them. A veteran named Gorman led them. 200 blades, give or take, eating one village after another and moving north with the spoils. That much Philip had heard on the road, and he rode hard to tell me because a peddler with a near monopoly in my little market does not want that market burned. Bart brought the part that mattered. Until a few days ago, he said, only people tied to us in Redwick had known Ashford was worth robbing. Now, every tavern from here to the river was singing the same tune. Rich land, weak walls, easy pickings. Someone was pushing that song out on purpose. I didn't need it spelled out. I had one neighbor with the merchant contacts to seed a rumor that clean, and a good reason to want the hoard pointed somewhere other than his own wheat fields. Viscount Arnold of Conley, cordial old Arnold, who'd take my hand at a feast and hand me to raiders in the same season and call it hard necessity. Percy said what everyone in the room was thinking. If the bandits came here, we had nowhere to run to. Ashford sat at the far northwest corner of the map. There was no next territory behind us to flee into, only the forest and the mountains and the dark. So we don't run, I said. Roland asked the practical thing. We had fewer than 20 finished crossbows and nowhere near enough bolts for a battle that size. We will, by the time they arrive. I heard how flat my own voice had gone and let it stay there. The noble world had spent Roland's old company as cannon fodder. It had spent Gorman the same way and now aimed the ruin of him at me to save a wheat harvest. I had watched my father burn people like fuel my whole childhood. I do not spend my own people cheaper than firewood, and I was not about to let Arnold spend them for me. Get everyone moving, I told Roland. We have work. Percy came at a run with the last of the warning. Philip had ridden through the night. The bandits had crossed into Conley and turned west. They would be at our gate by tomorrow, one day. It was just enough if we spent every hour of it. I met Philip in the square and thanked him plainly. A man who kills a horse to warn you has earned better than a nod, and told him to shelter in the manor. Then I put the whole settlement to work. The numbers had run far past Damien's first promise. 47 finished crossbows now, not 10. More than 1,500 bolts stacked in the workshop, short and heavy, and made to punch through armor. We had no stone wall, only the timber palisade, so we made the timber do the work of stone. Scaffolds went up along the inside so a man could stand and shoot down over the top. Log barricades went across the open ground before the gate, angled to herd anyone charging into a narrow throat, where the bolts could reach them from 3 sides at once. I stood in the square and told them we would win, not survive, win. Wipe the host out, not merely chase it off onto some other poor village the way Arnold had chased it onto us. I said it because it was true, and because a frightened settlement fights worse than a confident one, and both of those facts could sit in the same sentence without either one being a lie. The cold in me did the arranging while I talked. It laid out the killing ground without once flinching, where the barricades bit, where the bolts crossed, where the golems would come from. That part of me had never been much good at comfort. It was very good at this. Before the fighting, I emptied the house of everyone who could not hold a wall. Edgar would lead the women and the children out along the river to the southwest, and on to Conley itself if the defense broke. I gave him the hardest task on the ground, and he took it the way he took everything, with that old grief behind his eyes. He'd fled a burning village once and left people behind. He told me, low, that he would not do it a second time. He meant the children. I believed him. I set 2 more things in order in case I did not see the morning. I gave Anna every coin I owned and told her that if I fell, she was to build the survivors a life with it. She weighed the strongbox, kept her chin up, and asked whether she might really carry my message to the Viscount of Conley if it came to that. I told her she could. The message was that I would come back as a ghost and pull his house down around his ears. She laughed. It helped. Dark humor is a fine thing to hand people the night before a fight. Christy I found by the message I meant to leave her, a witnessed word that if I died, her bond was dissolved and she walked free. She wouldn't hear it. She caught my sleeve and said she would rather stay bound to me the rest of her days than be set loose by my dying. I hadn't planned on that. I let it stand. Matilda. I tried to send with the others. She refused before I finished the sentence. Every part of her was mine, she said, in that plain, unadorned way of hers, and her place was at my side and nowhere else. I did not ask again. Some arguments you lose the moment you understand you were always going to. At dawn, I gathered them where the road bent into the trees, and I told them to look behind. Behind us was Adrian, the longhouse, the fields, the bathhouse, and the mill, and every roof we had raised out of a death forest with our own hands. Most of these people had come here with nothing, from places that had thrown them away. I told them they finally had something worth standing for, so we would stand for it here, and we would still be living here tomorrow. Then, I sent them to their positions and walked into the trees with my guards. The road curved for a reason. I had built that curve. Gorman brought his 200 up it in a loose column, and I let them come deep, past the bend, to the place where the sight lines closed. Then I moved my hands. 2 golems came out of the tree line from opposite sides at a dead run. Wood golems are supposed to be slow, ponderous things, one to a mage, good for hauling logs. Mine hit the column like cavalry, one from the left and one from the right, faster and smoother than any man in armor, and the bandits' whole idea of the mourning came apart in a heartbeat. Men went down. The rest scattered, screaming that there were 2, that there were more, that something was in the trees. The world had believed the trash mage moved 1 puppet at a time. In 10 seconds, it learned otherwise. Gorman didn't scatter. He was a veteran, and he found the shape of it fast. Puppets meant a puppeteer, close by, watching. He hunted the rise where I stood. When his eyes found me, he threw his own sword at me across the whole gap, hard and flat and true. Matilda was already moving. She stepped into its path. Percy's blade knocked it spinning out of the air. Radley put a spear back down the same line at Gorman, and Gorman slid aside from it by a hand's width. And now they all knew my face. "We've been seen," Percy said. "Fall back to the gate. Go, go." I pulled the golems out of the press and I ran, and I was hopeless at it. Thin legs, a boy's body, 6 years of being kept indoors. I have never once been fast. Matilda made a short, disgusted sound, dropped her shield, and scooped me onto her back without breaking stride. Matilda ran, and I hung on, and behind us 200 men, 150 now after the trees, came howling across my fields. Roland's voice arrived inside my skull before we cleared the crops. He has a thin thread of the mind speech, enough to reach a short way, and he used it to tell me he had us in sight and the wall was ready. Then he added, dry even in my head, that I wasn't even running on my own legs. I told him to shut the gate behind me and open the wall. We came through the throat between the barricades with the horde close on our heels, and the wall opened up. 50 crossbows loosed at once from the scaffold. The front rank of the charge simply stopped being a rank. Short, heavy bolts, loosed downward from height into unarmored men packed into a narrow lane, do a thing that has to be seen. Farmers did that. Men who 6 months ago had never held a weapon, standing shoulder to shoulder on my wall, working the levers the way Damien had drilled them, reloading, loosing again. The lane between the barricades filled, and the bandits could not go through it and could not spread out of it, and the bolts kept coming down. Then Damien's ballista spoke. He'd built the great ground crossbow in secret and named it Gideon, after some hero out of the old tales he loved. It took 2 strong men to draw the string. It threw a bolt as thick as a fence pike, and the first one it loosed in anger dropped Gorman's lieutenant, where he stood and buried itself in the earth a spear's length beyond. Damien shrieked with joy from behind the cover, his weapon, his historic day, and no power on earth would have kept him off that wall. And into the boxed and staggering mass, I sent a golem, one construct, wading straight into the heart of them, throwing men aside like a farmer forking hay. Arrows and fire glanced off the hard semi-wood and did nothing. On its own, it accounted for a third of that host before the morning was out. The bandits tried to fall back and found they couldn't. Bart's men had sealed one side of the field. 2 more blocking groups, 15 each, had corked the flanks. Then Roland took 20 of the strongest out through the gate at a run, Zane among them, big and silent, and closed the last jaw of the trap. The 200-strong army that had eaten a dozen villages broke against a frontier settlement of farmers and beast folk and old outlaws. I watched it break from Matilda's back, and the cold in me was almost warm. Gorman saw it was lost, and he did the desperate thing. He forced up a body enhancement magic, a raw, unfinished one, the kind that lends a man a few minutes of speed and strength, and then turns on him and leaves him wrecked. He spent himself all at once for one purpose: kill the puppeteer, and maybe the golems fall with him. He came straight for me across the broken field, faster than anything that size had any right to move, screaming to be let through to the mage. Matilda set herself between us and did not give an inch. She met his enhanced speed with her own, rabbit beast folk quick, a burst no ordinary man can match, and kicked him full in the face as he closed. Two of my guards struck in from either side. He held all three of them off at once, roaring the same words over and over. Let me kill him. Let me at the brat, as if the wanting alone could carry him the last 10 feet. It couldn't. Matilda planted a second kick into him, cold and final, and told him no in the one plain word she gave him the whole battle. Roland's voice touched Gorman's mind then, the way it had touched mine. One word, above. Gorman looked up. He turned, and Zane was already there. The big tiger beast folk ended the charge in a single stroke, and it was over. Gorman went down and did not rise, and whatever last thought crossed him seemed almost mild, a flicker on Zane's face too, as if the two of them had met somewhere long ago, on some other field, before the war spent them both. Neither of them said it. There wasn't time. The men still standing threw down their blades. Bart and the others put them on their knees. The mourning went quiet, all at once, the way a hard rain stops. Roland crouched over the fallen leader for a long moment, and his face changed. He knew him. Gorman had been a comrade once, a joint hunt against an orc 3 years back. Two low men in a mercenary line who'd shared a fire and talked a little. Gorman had even had a half-formed gift for magic. Roland said it quietly, that the two of them had been the same kind of man, and that the only difference in the end was which way the road had bent under each of them. Then he stood, because there was work, and Roland always chose the work. Anna came running with the count, and it was a mercy dressed as a wound. Not one of ours dead, but more than 10 hurt badly. 2 who would never see again. 3 who had lost the use of a limb. 1 who would not walk. Victory has a price, and it always comes due on somebody. I told her to send to Redwick for a doctor that hour, and that every wounded settler and every family would be paid, and paid well, out of my own coffers. Bart brought the prisoners forward, 42 of them, kneeling, waiting to hear it. I handed them to lawful custody for a fixed term of bonded labor, men who'd come to burn my people out, set to honest work under guard until their sentence ran, then freed. Not slaughtered, not turned loose to raid the next village either. One of them burned through his ropes with a scrap of fire magic and bolted. Bart put him down with a wound to the shoulder before he made the barricade, and the man was suddenly desperate to swear he would never run again. I had him held and his sentence lengthened, and I said it so the rest could hear. Run, and you earn a longer-term breaking rock. Serve quiet, and you serve your time and walk away. After that, no one ran. Philip came to me with his hat in his hands, and his honesty, for once, all the way out. He hadn't ridden through the night for love of me, he admitted. He'd done it because Ashford was his best market, and he wanted the great favor my gratitude would buy. I liked him better for saying it plainly. I gave him a shop in the territory and the standing of favored merchant, a building of his own, and loans if he needed them, and the man nearly wept. May caught my elbow after and asked, low, whether I was sure. Hadn't this same Philip once sold word to the Viscount of Conley? He had. That was rather the point. A peddler who informs for coin is a loose thread until you sew him to yourself, and I had just sewn him to Ashford with a shop he'd never risk losing. I told her as much, and told her to go sit down and rest. She was carrying Roland's child, and she'd been on her feet since before the dawn. She went, grumbling that she couldn't just stand by while everyone else worked. That was the whole trouble with the people I'd gathered. Not one of them knew how to stand by. Late, when the house had gone still, Matilda and I sat in the lamplight and let the day set down its weight. I thanked her for my life. Twice over, that morning, the sword in the trees, the leader on the field. I'm not always good with the plain things, but I managed that one. She said she guarded me because I was precious to her. No more than that, and no less, in her sparse, unadorned voice, still calling me Lord Adrian, the way she always would. What had sat unspoken between us for a long time did not need a speech. It simply settled, quietly, into the room and stayed. I let it. After a day spent arranging a killing ground without flinching, it was a strange relief to find there was still a part of me that a plain sentence like that could reach. Then I sat with the ledger in my head a while longer, because the battle was won, and the war of it was only starting. A name had been made today, mine. The trash son thrown out to die had broken an army, and names like that travel. Word of the victory ran through the neighboring lands, and most of them were glad of it. One man was not. Arnold of Conley heard that Ashford still stood and felt dread, not relief, because he was the one who had steered the horde onto me. He'd meant to let them bleed me thin and then ride in the hero, the savior of his poor young neighbor, and gather up my weakened territory afterward. Instead, I had won clean, and now I was in his reception room. I brought Matilda and Bart and let the two of them stand there, radiating quiet. Bart set a heavy bag on the table with a solid clatter, and I drew out a crossbow and laid it before the Viscount like a gift. I told him what it was, a weapon that made any farmer an archer with no years of training, and that I had more than 100 of them. That last part was a lie. I had fewer than 50. He had no way to count them. I mentioned my golem too, and that it alone had accounted for a third of 200 men. I said all of it pleasantly. Then I set the real matter on the table beside the crossbow. There had been a rumor, I said, that Ashford was rich and soft and undefended. Strange how fast it spread. It would be a great shame if a second rumor were to travel just as fast. The one about a Viscount who tried to feed his loyal young neighbor to raiders and hide his own hands. A man branded a coward like that would find every door in the north closed to him. Arnold denied all of it, of course. Swore he'd only heard the tale, never made it. His face did the confessing, his mouth wouldn't. Cornered, sweating under his own tall, bright windows, he asked what he could do for me. In exchange, naturally, for those unfortunate rumors staying buried. I could have ruined him. It would have been easy, and it would have felt good, and it would have left me with a dead enemy and nothing else. A neighbor who owes you and fears you is worth a great deal more than a neighbor in the ground. It was mercy. It was also a ledger. Both were true, and I had long since stopped pretending they weren't. So I named my price. He would sponsor me, introduce me, and see me accepted into the Northwest noble faction, the company of counts and marquises, the world my father moved in, far to the south, certain to his last breath that the boy he'd caged and dumped was 6 years dead. Arnold agreed. He had no other move on the board. I thanked him warmly, and we drank to the new friendship between our houses, and I walked out of Conley with the door standing open into the world that had thrown me away. The cold in me kept its patient watch the whole way home, and for once, the two of us wanted exactly the same thing. The doors opened on a room that had already decided what I was. I had bought my way through them with a Viscount signature and 5 crossbows sold at a friendly price, and now half the Northwest faction stood between me and the wine, every one of them turning to look. Some looked at me, the frontier boy who had broken 200 bandits with a village of 200 farmers. Most of them looked at Matilda. She walked a pace behind my shoulder, ears up, hands quiet, giving the room nothing. The room gave her plenty, a beast-folk companion, kept openly at a noble's side, in a hall where such things were meant to wait outside with the horses. I had been warned to leave her home. I had brought her anyway. If I was going to be talked about, I preferred to choose the subject. Arnold steered me toward the head of the room, muttering that I might at least try to look humble. I told him I was trying. He didn't laugh, which meant he believed me. Marquis Godfrey Bexley waited at the top of the hall, past 50, broad, dressed like a man who had stopped needing to prove anything decades ago. He greeted Arnold like an old hound he was fond of, and a little tired of, then turned the whole weight of his attention on me. He knew the story already. The bandit host in the west, the village that should have burned and didn't. He thanked me for the service, as if I had done it for the faction and not for my own skin. And I let him, because that was what the thanks were for. When Arnold started to explain his own small part, the Marquis cut him off with a smile and a remark about a Viscount who had been frightened enough to go spreading rumors, and Arnold went the color of the wine. Then Bexley said he had heard I made an interesting weapon and that he hoped I had brought it along. He looked forward to it, he said, the way a man looks forward to a card he already knows is in his hand. I told him I had. I told him I hoped it would suit the room. Arnold walked me through the introductions, like a man showing off a horse he wasn't sure wouldn't bite. Barons, viscounts, a count or two, careful appraisal from some, a curled lip from others, and always the flick of the eyes back to the rabbit-eared woman at my shoulder. Count Marcus was the one who said it out loud. He was the faction's second-ranking man, from a house that measured worth in swords and saddle hours, and he looked at Matilda the way you look at mud tracked across a clean floor. He informed me that a lord who did not know noble etiquette should at least have the sense to hide it. Then he told me to ruin my own name however I pleased, but not to drag Arnold's or the faction's down with me. I could have argued. I didn't. I told him I knew my ways looked strange, and that if I had made him uncomfortable, I was sorry for the discomfort, not, I was careful to add, for the cause of it. Matilda stayed exactly where she was. So did I. Marcus held my eye a moment, decided I wasn't worth a scene at another man's party, and moved off. Beside me, Arnold let out a breath he'd been holding since the county line. I told him I meant to build a place where my strangeness was simply the price of doing business with me. The cold in me had come to the party too, and it liked this room better than I did. All these smiling men who could be bought, sorted, and kept. I only had to make myself worth more than the mud on Marcus's floor. I found my one friend in the room by accident, over by the windows. Baron Ogden was round, pink, and beaming, and he had a cat girl in a frilled dress and more jewels than sense standing shy at his elbow. Cleo, he called her, the sweetest creature in the kingdom, and he said it loudly enough that 3 nearby nobles winced. He'd heard I kept a beastfolk companion. He had come to find out if the rumor was true, and when he saw Matilda, he lit up like a feast day. We talked longer than either of us meant to. He praised Matilda, spirited and lovely, and plainly well cared for, and I said the same of Cleo until the poor girl went scarlet and hid half behind him. Men like us have a hard road in this world, he said, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. We ought to hold together. It was the warmest thing anyone had said to me all night, and he meant every word, which in that room made him either a fool or the only honest man present. I decided I liked him too much to care which. He begged me to visit his lands. I invited him to mine, and meant it. Behind me, I felt rather than saw Matilda's shoulders come down half an inch. She had spent the whole evening braced. Ogden had just made the party for one moment somewhere she was allowed to be. Bexley grew bored of small talk and decided it was time for his novelty. He led me to the front of the hall, and the whole room went quiet at a flick of his hand, a quiet I could never have bought for myself. Then he gave me the floor. I told them I had brought a gift, a new weapon, made in my territory. Percy carried it out and held it up. Plain wood and iron, nothing that looked like it ought to frighten a room full of armored men. I explained it in a sentence, because the thing explained itself. It held the drawn string with no muscle at all. A farmer could aim it, a child could aim it. It asked for no years at the training yard, no strong arm, no knightly anything. Then I stopped explaining and let Percy show them. At the end of the hall stood a dummy, dressed in a full suit of plate, good plate, the kind that turns a sword and shrugs off an arrow. Percy raised the weapon, took a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bolt crossed the room faster than the eye could follow and punched clean through the breastplate, through it. It buried itself so deep in the straw behind that only the flights still showed, quivering, while the plate rang like a struck bell and went still. Nobody spoke. A hall full of men who had spent their whole lives learning that armor was the difference between a knight and a corpse. All of them staring at a hole a farmhand had made in a breastplate with one finger. Then they spoke at once. Which ones could they buy? How many? How soon? I let the questions wash over me and kept my face polite and my number vague. Better they believe my armory ran deeper than it did. A man is safer when the room can't count his teeth. Count Marcus cut through it, loud enough for everyone. A weapon any coward could fire without training, he said, was an insult to a warrior's pride. There was no honor in it. He wasn't wrong. That was the whole point. Honor is what you reach for when you don't have a hole in the other man's breastplate. I didn't say so. Bexley said something close to it for me, smiling, and Count Sullivan agreed, and Marcus was left standing on a shrinking island of men who still believed the future would ask their permission first. While the room was still off balance, I gave them the second gift. Rosetta came out with a tray, and the nobles leaned in expecting another weapon and got thin golden slices of something fried and salted instead. Potato, I told them, a crop from the southern continent. It grows where wheat won't, yields more from worse ground, keeps through a winter, and fills a belly as well as bread. I watched the word famine move behind their eyes. These were men who lay awake over their grain stores. I had just handed them a crop that didn't care about bad soil. Marcus reached the tray before anyone. The same count who had called my weapon dishonorable a minute earlier wanted to know if he could buy the potato at once and whether I would teach him to grow it. I said yes to both and revised my opinion of him on the spot. A proud man who will still swallow his pride when his people's supper is at stake makes a more useful enemy than most friends. Bexley teased him for taking the bait. Marcus ate another slice and didn't rise to it. Around us, the rest of the faction closed in, and by the time the candles burned low, I had sold both my sword and my bread to half the Northwest. The party was the easy part. The bill came due over the next 3 days. Bexley lent me a room and his own scribes, and one after another, the nobles came to sign, 24 of them by the second afternoon, then a dozen more, until I had put my name to more contracts than I had in my whole life, and my hand had stopped being able to feel the pen. Matilda stayed at my side through all of it. She had been offered a day to see the city and turned it down. "A holiday I can't spend near you isn't one, Lord Adrian," she said, and went back to holding the pages flat. On the last evening, when I was folded over a sofa like a dropped coat, the Marquis came to find me himself. He didn't waste it. He wanted to know why. Crossbows and potatoes were too much to give away for a seat at a table. No man hands a stranger the keys to his own strength. What was I really buying? So I told him the truth, because the truth was the most useful thing I owned. I told him I was a count's cast-off son, dumped on a forest at 15 with a title meant to be the place I quietly died in, by a man in the southeast who was certain I already had. I didn't say the name. I didn't need to. I had no house behind me, I said. No blood I could call on, nothing but what I could build, and whoever I could make need me. And that was the whole aim. Not just to join his faction, to become the man his faction could not afford to lose, so that the next time a powerful lord decided I was disposable, it would cost him more than he cared to pay. Bexley was quiet a while. Then he laughed low and said my hunger for safety looked like cowardice until you noticed I had spent my best cards to buy it, and that made it almost brave. Not like a noble at all, he said. He liked it. As leader of the Northwest faction, he would see my peace kept. I thanked him and meant it. Somewhere under the thanks, the cold made its quiet note that I had just set a marquee between myself and my father's whole world, and had done it smiling. 10 days after I left, the carriage rolled back through the gate of Adria, and I was out of it before it stopped rolling. I would have denied it in the noble world, but I loved the place. The raw palisade, the mud, the smell of new timber, the whole stubborn argument I had built against being thrown away. Roland met me with his arms crossed. All this fuss, he said, for a lord who just conquered a faction with vegetables. Anna thanked me for my hard work with a straight face that did nothing to hide how glad she was. Christy waved a fistful of new reports at me before I had both feet on the ground. Damien shouted from somewhere that the crossbows were stacking up faster than we could crate them. It had been, I told them, a complete success. Then May swept in to inform me that in my absence, she had founded a women's association, that the whole settlement now knew rather more about my private habits than I would have chosen, and that I should probably not ask. I did not ask. Some victories you win by retreating. Spring loosened the roads, and the roads brought people, and I met every one of them at the door myself. A strong first welcome is cheap, and it lasts. Philip came first, giving up the peddler's cart to settle as my first resident merchant. I handed him the biggest shopfront on the main street, a warehouse behind it, and a handful of freeholders' children to train as clerks. He could hardly believe the place was his. Then, while he was still grateful, I let him understand, gently, the way you'd close a hand, that I knew he had once carried reports on my territory back to Arnold. His face went still. I told him the past was paid and forgotten, and that from today, his interests and mine shared one fate: prosper together or sink together. He heard both halves of it, which was the point. A man watched is a man loyal. Once he learns the watching comes with a warehouse. Then Father Harold arrived, lean and young, and so humble it was almost painful to watch, with a wife and 2 quiet sisters of the church behind him, and a request he plainly expected me to refuse: leave to build a church in Adria. Most small lords balk at the cost. I said yes before he had finished asking, and offered to pay for the whole of it myself. He was astonished. I let him be. I told the priest it was atonement for the 2 years I had left my people with nowhere to bring their children for the blessing. That was true. It was also the cheapest goodwill a kingdom-wide faith ever sold, and a nationwide order that owed me a favor was worth far more than the coin the walls would cost. Both were true, and I had stopped bothering to separate them. Not a week later, an old man climbed down from a hired carriage at the gate. Dr. Sylvan, 90 years old and a quarter of an elf, who had handed his Redwick clinic to a student and come looking for somewhere to finish a long life. He had chosen Ashford, he said, because he had watched how I treated my people through the sickness and the fighting, and a man could do worse than end his days under a kind lord. I gave him a house and a clinic on the spot, and told him the honor was mine. For once, I wasn't calculating anything when I said it. Arnold had gone from a cornered neighbor to something almost like a friend, which made me trust him exactly as far as a man should trust a fox who has decided you are worth being loyal to. He invited me to tea, a rare southwestern blend. A little of it pressed on me as a gift, and we talked shop first. Crossbows copied badly by other lords, mine still the truest of them. Potatoes spreading across the faction. Wheat, he mentioned, was creeping up in price with the fighting out west, which made a crop that grew on poor ground look better by the month. I filed that last part away. Wheat only climbs like that when someone, somewhere, is already thinking about how to feed an army. Then Arnold set down his cup and asked my age. 17, I told him. Old enough, he said, and made his real offer, his 4th daughter, for my wife. I had seen it coming from the far side of the tea, and I didn't pretend otherwise. I told him plainly what he would be marrying into, that I took marriage for a duty and an alliance, not a love match, and that whatever wife I brought home would have to understand one thing before anything else. Matilda's place at my side was not up for negotiation. Not now, not after any wedding, not ever. Arnold didn't blink. His daughter carried no scorn for beast folk, he said, and already knew how things stood in my house. She had been told, and she had agreed. He asked only that she be treated well. Behind me, Matilda stood as still as she had stood all winter and said nothing, and I chose not to guess what the stillness cost her. I told him I would meet the girl. That was as far as I would go in one afternoon, and then he startled me by wanting to arrange it that very hour. I put him off, barely. A wife I hadn't met, a house I hadn't decided to open, a peace bought with weapons and bread. I could not stay a bachelor lord forever, and a marriage into Conley would armor my flank as surely as any faction would. It was sensible. Everything about it was sensible. I walked out of Arnold's mansion with one more door swinging open into the world that had once thrown me away, and I told myself, the whole road home, that sensible was the same thing as safe. Arnold's fourth daughter looked at me the way you look at a bill you can't pay. I had told him, back in the winter, that I would consider the marriage favorably. That one polite sentence had bought me this room. Arnold beaming, his wife Eleanor gracious, and 10 years younger than her age, had any right to make her, and the girl between them going pale. "This is my fourth daughter, Clara," Arnold said. Clara gave the greeting she had clearly practiced. She named her house, called it an honor, kept her eyes on the carpet. Then Matilda shifted her weight behind my chair, and Clara's gaze snagged on the rabbit ears, and whatever color she had left drained out of her face. Eleanor caught it before it could sit in the room. "Clara is only shy," she said lightly. "Your bearing overwhelms her, Lord Adrian." I played along because that was what the hour required, and Clara let me. But the tea went cold in polite little sips, and nobody at that table believed the shy story, least of all the girl. She had been handed to a stranger for the good of her father's boarders, and the stranger had brought the woman he loved along to watch. I could not blame the darkness in her face. I had worn it myself once, at a different table. We rode back toward Adria with the wheels ticking over the ruts and neither of us saying much. "She's frightened," Matilda said at last. "Not of you, of me." I told her I was sorry. Sorry to drag her into a marriage arranged over her head. Sorry she had to stand in a room and be the thing another girl was afraid of. Matilda was quiet for a mile. Then she asked me for something, and she asked it plainly, the way she asked for very little. "When you marry Lady Clara," she said, "keep a place that is only mine, different from a wife, from a guard, from your people, unchanging, for as long as I live. If I have that, I can love you the rest of it. I have negotiated with counts and merchants and men holding knives, and none of them ever cornered me the way that quiet request did." I took her hand. I told her she had been at my side since I was 9 years old, that no wife and no title would ever move her from where she stood, and that I would love her until they put me in the ground. She let out a breath she had been holding, I think, for weeks. In the swaying dark of the carriage, that was enough. The next visit, I took tea with Clara alone, only servants at the walls. She began by apologizing for herself. She said she was a dull girl who had never left the manor, that her only worth was the name over the door, that surely I was wasted on her. I had given versions of that speech to myself in a locked room, so I didn't argue. I changed the subject instead. I told her about the boy I had been, the one who read every book in a count's library because books were the only thing in that house that never looked at him with contempt. I still had the notebooks. I had walked out of that county with a crate of borrowed histories and never given them back. Something moved in her face. "You like history?" "I like anything I can learn from." "I read history," Clara said, and for the first time all week she forgot to be afraid. "I remember all of it. It's the one thing She stopped, embarrassed by her own eagerness. I told her the Ashford Library was hers, notes and stolen books and all. She looked at me then as if I'd handed her a key to a door she'd assumed would stay locked. It cost me nothing. It was, I would learn, the best trade I made that year. While the marriage arranged itself, I kept building. The frost broke, and I closed the deal that mattered most for the money. Victor, the dwarf miner, agreed to leave his old company and bring his whole crew of apprentices to Ashford to work the Restone veins. I ended my rough stone contract with Benedict of the Miles Trading Company and started a new one for finished goods, running the sales through Philip's little house so the profits stayed under my own roof. Dominic's carpenters started a whole new village at the foot of the mountains for the miners who were coming. Victor walked the diggings with me and grunted at the seams like a man reading a letter from home. "Good stone here, my lord," he said. "Iron under it too, if I'm any judge." He was. But the ore was months off. What I had that morning was the shape of it. Trade routes tied down, a company of my own, a town rising where there had been trees. A boy thrown away on trash land, salting that land with mines. When Clara came to see the territory, I gave her the full tour. Houses, farms, public baths. The fields where Christie grew things no one else bothered to. She admired all of it and quietly counted herself out of it, as if a place this alive could have no room for her. So I cheated. I'd told Percy to find me halfway through with some urgent nothing, and he did, pulling a face the whole time. "You're sure about this?" he muttered as he led me off, leaving them alone together. "You're a merciless man, my lord." I was. I left Clara standing in the experimental field with Matilda, sent her own attendant away on an errand, and walked off to let two women, who both thought they were the problem, discover they were the same person. I did not hear the start of it. Matilda told me the rest later, and Clara filled in the parts Matilda was too shy to repeat. Clara broke first. She confessed to Matilda what she could not say to me, that beside a companion who had chosen this life, she felt like a treaty in a dress, an obstacle in her own marriage. And Matilda, who knew exactly what it was to feel worth less than the room you stood in, did not comfort her. She recruited her. "My happiness isn't in keeping him to myself," Matilda said. "It's in seeing him happy. I can't do that alone. I want us to be comrades in it. You and I, each holding up the part of his life the other one can't reach." Clara stared at her. Then she asked the question underneath all the others. The one I recognized because I had asked it in a shed at 15. Was she allowed to be happy here? To have a purpose that was hers and not just a duty owed? Matilda told her that in Ashford, everyone was allowed that. Then she suggested, half bold and half mortified at her own daring, that a woman who loved history and remembered all of it might build a school and teach it. I came back around the hedge in time to hear them talking about me, my clingier, softer side, the one I keep behind a locked door, and both of them laughing about it like sisters who had known each other for years. I stepped out from the hedge, and Clara buried her face in her hands. I had planned a distant marriage. Two polite people, a shared roof, a shared ledger, nothing risked. I had walked into this hour intending to be sensible and safe. They had ruined that, the pair of them, in an afternoon. "You two seem to have gotten along," I said. It came out rougher than I meant. "I'm glad." Clara lowered her hands. She said she would live here in her own way, that she wanted to be happy too, that she would earn her place instead of decorating it. I looked at the two of them standing there, the woman who had chosen me when I had nothing, and the girl who had just chosen to stop being a treaty, and something in my chest that I keep bolted shut came loose. "Thank you, both of you." My voice did a thing I did not authorize. "Let's live together from now on. Let's be happy." I stopped. "No, I'll make us happy." The night before the wedding, I took Matilda aside and put a small box in her hand. Inside was a ring, lapis from our own mountains, cut by the best jeweler in the Northwest, and the same design, to the stone, as the wedding band Clara would wear the next morning. Matilda understood it before I could explain, and her composure cracked straight down the middle. "This isn't Clara's," I said. "It's yours. I had it made in secret. You've stood beside me since I was 9 years old, longer and closer than anyone alive. If a ring is proof of a love that doesn't end, then the first one was always going to be yours." She wept, and I held her, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. When she could speak, she told me she was the happiest woman in the world. I have collected a great many things in my life by being clever. That one I hadn't earned by cleverness, and I knew it. We were married in the middle of July, hastily by noble standards, in the Conley Chapel, and then they poured the whole Northwest into the reception hall to greet us in the order of their rank. The first man across that crowded floor to take my hand was Marquis Godfrey Bexley, a marquis, crossing a full hall to congratulate me first. Behind him came a count's son, and old Count Sullivan with his soft voice and his hard eyes, and Baron Ogden barreling up with his wife and his freed companion both, laughing that a man could love two women equally if he only had the sense to give each the same ring. My own household, handed back to me as a blessing instead of a scandal. I stood there, and under the warmth, the cold thing in me kept its patient watch and did the arithmetic. A little more than 2 years ago, a man in the southeast had looked at me and seen a grave already dug, a bastard son dropped on Monsterland to save the cost of a rope, a name he could stop saying by summer and never miss. He was, at that hour, somewhere in his county, certain the boy was long dead. And here that boy stood, in a hall full of the great houses of the Northwest, married into a viscount's line, greeted first by a marquis, called a peer by every rank the man himself would have bowed to. The lie that I was worthless was cracking, right there, in public, in front of the exact world my father lived in. I did not gloat. I did not raise a glass to it or say a word. That was the discipline of it. The crack was only the first payment on a debt I meant to collect in full, on my own schedule, and not a moment before. I filed the mourning away with the rest of the ledger. Then I turned and thanked the Marquis for the honor, and meant not one syllable of it. Arnold found me at the end, tired and a little sad, and asked me once more to make his daughter happy. I swore I would. That one I meant. That one half a day's travel brought us home, and Adria came out to the last man to meet its new lady. They lined the road, every soul in the territory, miners, farmers, children on shoulders, and Roland led the retainers out to welcome her. On behalf of all your people, he said, we celebrate your entry into the house. We'll serve the Ashford family with our lives. The girl who had gone pale in her father's reception room a season ago stepped down from the carriage and answered him without a tremor. She told them she would work to be worth their loyalty, that she looked forward to building something with them. Then she smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes. Matilda stood at my other side, wearing her ring. Clara wore hers. Whatever the great houses thought a household should be, this was mine. Built the way I built everything, out of people who chose it. Midsummer and the regular council. Clara and Matilda both at the table now. The reports were good, one after another. May's Women's Association was holding lectures for new mothers and minding each other's children so the mothers could work. Edgar's wheat had come in fast. Damien had built a many-toothed comb that stripped the grain in a fraction of the old time, and he went red when they praised it. Anna reported the mines. Iron, copper, the second lapis vein. The whole investment paid back inside a year. Then Roland set his hands flat on the table, and the good mood went out of the room. War's coming, he said. Grain prices are climbing. Iron's climbing the way it climbs before a kingdom needs a great deal of it fast. Bart sees it in the markets. Victor sees it in the ore. It's a gut feeling from an old mercenary, but it's the same feeling I've had before. And I was right then, next year, or the one after, with Lancel out west. Nobody argued. I had smelled the same thing on the wheat at Arnold's tea, months back. I told Roland he was right, and that we would start preparing now, not for the war only, but for the years of chaos a war leaves behind it. The peace I had spent 3 years building had just been given a deadline. Clara made war preparation look like hope. She brought me a finished teaching plan 2 weeks after I'd freed Roland from the mines to help her, and it was thorough enough that I read the whole thing at my desk and told her so. She had proposed a school to her father once, years ago, and been refused. The rich families in Conley didn't want the poor ones learning to read. There were no old rich families in Ashford to object. That was the quiet advantage of building on land nobody had wanted. Roland walked the site with me. A school first, he said. No payoff you can bank. I'd not have guessed it. Give it years and it pays better than a mine, I told him. When the chaos comes, people who can read and reckon are worth more than gold. I want them learning before the trouble, not after. It would be free, paid from my own purse, open to any child a family could spare from the fields, and with low taxes and potatoes in every cellar, a good many could. It would open the next month. The territory had passed 500 souls, so I raised it an army, 50 men to start. Roland their commander in all but the paperwork. They weren't much yet, but they stood in a straight rank in the yard, and Roland had drilled them till they looked the part. And I meant to grow them to 100, and then, someday, to a full 1,000. Hard to believe I might hold a real rank one day, Roland said, watching his soldiers. But if it's you doing the raising, my lord, you just might pull it off. Behind the drilling, the rest of the machine turned. Christy had soybeans coming in well enough to press our own oil next year, and was chasing sugar out of beets besides, until I caught her working herself gray and ordered her to rest. And Bart was quietly buying salt through Eliza's shop in Redwick. A 5-year stockpile slipped in a little at a time, so no one asked why a small frontier barony wanted so much. Everything I built now, I built with one eye on the war, on the Yowie. The last thing I secured, I went to the church for. Father Harold nearly dropped his cup when I named the amount. A whole pot of Angel's honey concentrate, where nobles bought it by the small bottle. Watered thin, the church sold it as a painkiller. Full strength, it dropped a grown man into hours of deep, forced sleep. For what purpose, my lord? Harold asked, wary. If it went against the teachings, we could not give it. I told him the truth. If the war reached my border, I wanted a way to turn attackers back without killing them. His face eased at that, and he agreed to gather it from every church he could reach. Later, walking the wall with Roland, I gave him the rest of it. We would boil the concentrate down to a resin and paint it on our crossbow bolts. A man hit would not die. He would fall asleep in the mud and wake a prisoner. Roland's jaw worked. A battle settled by sleeping draft instead of steel. It doesn't sit right with me, not because it's cruel. The opposite. I just don't trust leaning on a brew we can't fully control. I let him have his unease. It was an honest one. But I had told Harold I wanted to spare lives, and that was true. I also wanted enemy soldiers dreaming in the dirt instead of bleeding out in it, because a sleeping man cannot swing back. and a dead man leaves brothers who never forgive. The mercy and the arithmetic had stopped being two different things to me a long time ago. It was a last resort. I hoped never to need it. The marriage had begun as the sensible move, the safe one, an alliance to armor my flank. It had become something I would now be afraid to lose. So I did what I always did with the things I could not bear to lose. I armed for the day someone came to take them. The part came out of the press whole. No hammering, no filing. A crossbow lock stamped in a single pull, cooling in Damien's soot-black hand the exact shape it needed to be. He held it up to me, the way a boy holds up a fish he caught himself. Assembly's easier, breakages are fewer, and I can stamp 10 in the time the old way beat out one, he said. How about it? I turned it over in my fingers. It was clean work. A month ago, every crossbow in Adria had been shaped by hand, one slow piece at a time, and the wall between us and a real war had been exactly that thin. The press had not even been his idea, and it gnawed at him. Christy had watched him sweat over the numbers, then asked, in the mild voice she used when she already knew she was right, why he didn't just build a mold and squeeze the hot iron into shape the way her oil press squeezed soybeans. She had reinvented the whole method over breakfast without knowing it had a name. A perspective from someone who never learned smithing, Damien said, half proud of her and half wounded. I spent my whole life certain iron had to be beaten. How could I not see it? Because you're a smith, I told him. She isn't. That's why I keep both of you. The rest of it had come up out of the ground. The mining base in the Restone Mountains had struck iron and copper both, and cheap local ore had turned this little forge into a proper works. Refugee smiths at the benches, big oxfolk and lionfolk laborers leaning on the press. He'd hired half of them himself. I looked at the ballista standing finished against the far wall and told him to build 3. 1 to keep for our own walls. 2 to send to the faction lords who kept asking what the frontier baron was making out here in the cold. Damien was still grinning about the third when the door opened behind us. Percy waited until I'd stepped out of the noise. He'd ridden in from the guard station, and he wore the careful look he got when something didn't sit right. An immigrant had come in on the southern road, he said. Nothing strange in that. We took new people every week now, except this one claimed to know me, and her papers put her origin in Vance County, in the far southeast. That stopped me. Almost no one was supposed to know that name in the same breath as mine. My father had dumped me on this land to die quietly, and he'd taken some trouble to keep the disposal quiet. A discarded son is an embarrassment, and the Count did not care to be embarrassed. Someone traveling a month up the length of the kingdom to find me here was not nothing. I thought it strange too, Percy said, but there's no smell of a knife on her, and she said one name would settle it. He hesitated. Daphne Aldwin. I stood there in the cold with the hammer noise behind me and felt something old turn over in my chest. Of course she did, I said. Daphne Aldwin is the woman who built my golems. She was older than the handwriting in my memory, a composed woman past her 30s, plain traveling clothes, ink worn permanently into the side of one hand. I had never once seen her face. Everything between us had been letters. I'd been 10 years old when I commissioned those golems, and I'd spent nearly every coin of my allowance to do it, writing to a workshop in a far port city because a caged boy with no future wanted 2 tireless things that would do what he told them. She had built me her masterpieces and never once asked why a child in a count's house needed laborers who never slept. Those 2 golems had cut my first road into the death forest. They had plowed my first field. Half of everything I owned had been dug or hauled or raised by her work. It's been a while, Your Excellency of Ashford, she said and dipped her head. Or it was Lord Adrian in the letters. Forgive an old habit. Matilda, at my shoulder, inclined her head. It's been a while, Lady Aldwin. The 2 of them had corresponded once, arranging a repair, a small history I'd forgotten I'd set up. I asked her the only question that mattered. Why come here? Why cross the whole kingdom? She told me, and the telling put the frost into it. Vance had rotted. My father had let a great trading house from a republic across the southern sea open its doors in his port and swallow the market whole. Cheaper goods, foreign make, and every local workshop starved out inside a few years. Hers among them. The Aldwin name had meant something in that city for a generation, and the Count had traded it away for whatever the foreign house counted into his palm. He had ruined his own craftsmen to keep himself comfortable. It had happened, she said, at just about the season a certain son of his had quietly disappeared. I cursed him plainly then, and caught myself, and apologized for the language. Daphne only looked at me as though I'd said the thing she had traveled a month to hear. Here is what I did not say out loud. The cold part of me, the part that keeps its patient watch even when the rest of me is warm, sat very still and did the arithmetic. The man who had thrown me on this land to save the price of a rope was, in those same years, squeezing his own county so hard that its best hands were pulling up their roots and walking north. To me, his discarded son, the woman who had built the tools that made my whole life possible, had left his ruin and come to build in mine. That was not luck. That was his own hand, writing the entry himself. Another stone pried loose from his wall and set into mine, and he didn't even know he'd lost it. I didn't gloat. Gloating spends a thing, and I wanted this one kept. I only offered her what I offered every craftsman who came to me: a workshop, a house, a place where the work was wanted. And then I offered her the other thing, the real one. Build here, I said. Make it worth every coin he lost driving you out. Let your success be our answer to him. She grinned, the first unguarded thing she'd done since she walked in. Then let's take our revenge, my lord. The ballista sat fixed on its pedestal, and the bolt they'd laid in it wasn't a bolt. Where the head should have been there was a sealed clay pot, no bigger than a fist, packed with oil and painted around its belly with one of Daphne's ignition patterns. A magic stone at its base woke the pattern. Break the pot, and the pattern lit the oil. Pull the stone out, and the whole thing went back to being a harmless jar you could stack in a cart. Down the field stood a dozen scarecrows, roped together shoulder to shoulder the way men stand in a charge. Percy glanced at me. I gave the nod. Fire, he called. The ballista threw the pot the length of the field. It struck the middle of the pack. The clay burst, and a sheet of fire went up across the whole line of straw men in a single breath. By the time the sound reached us, there was nothing left standing but the flame. Damien made a noise like a delighted child. My ballista turned into that. How did you even think of it? Out of a book, I told him. An old war manual, clay pots of oil with a cloth fuse, hurled over walls by hand. A vicious idea and a stupid one, as likely to burn the man throwing it as the enemy. All I'd done was take the danger out of my own people's hands and set it a field away and let Daphne's pattern do the lighting instead of a fuse and a prayer. Roland had watched the fire without any of Damien's joy. You three talk about a thing like that the way other men talk about the weather, he said. Fired into a packed formation. One of those breaks a whole company. Doesn't it give you any pause? It did. I told him the truth of it anyway, and then I turned to Daphne. Make me 100. By year's end. I felt Roland's eyes on the side of my face and let him look. My father had spent men like firewood, fed a whole mercenary company into a hopeless fight to save himself a few crowns, and Roland was one of the few who had walked out of that betrayal alive. I had decided a long time ago that I would burn every jar of oil and every crown I owned before I ever fed one of my own people into a battle to win it. 100 fire arrows meant that when the war came, and it was coming, I could break an army at the wall and bury none of mine to do it. That was the whole of the arithmetic. It wasn't gentle. It was mine. Roland was quiet a while. Then he said he was glad, on the whole, that he'd knelt to me on that road years ago instead of meeting me across a field. Coming from him, that was nearly a blessing. Clara had put it to me over breakfast, in the careful way she asked for the things she'd already decided mattered. One of her students had a wall in front of her, and the wall was the girl's own father. So I went to the schoolhouse that afternoon with Matilda, and Dr. Sylvan brought the girl through to his office. Lily, thin, earnest, hands knotted together in her lap. I placed the family before he finished. Russell's daughter. Early settlers from the first year, when Adria held fewer than 50 souls all told. Russell had lost a leg in the bandit fighting and sat at the soybean press now, doing the seated work I'd found for him. That was the knot of it. Dr. Sylvan had kept that leg from being the death of Russell, and the girl had watched it happen and decided she wanted to be the one holding the needle next time. She wanted to be a doctor. I've taught a great many students, Sylvan said. She is the gifted one. I would take her as my own apprentice and give her everything I know. He spread his hands, old, spotted, quarter-elf hands. Among his mother's people, he added, a woman healer raised no eyebrows at all. The elves had counted the genders equal since long before the kingdom was drawn. But he was a guest in a human territory, and he would not step over a father's word in a man's own house. Lily didn't say much. When I told her I remembered the winter her family had come in, and her father hauling water on a leg that was barely his own yet, her eyes went bright and she looked hard at the floor. I have never had much patience for a rule whose only argument is that it has always been the rule. This is a lord's business as much as anyone's, I said. I'll speak to your father myself. We went that evening. Russell nearly took the door off its hinge when he found his lord standing outside a farmer's cottage. His wife recovered faster and had us seated and watered before he'd finished stammering. I told him plainly why I'd come. His daughter wanted to study medicine, and I'd like his blessing on it. He didn't give it easily. He had never heard of a woman doctor in his life, he said. Who would trust her? Who would take her on? What would become of her when the novelty wore thin, and she was neither wife nor healer, nor anything a village knew how to place? It wasn't cruelty. It was a father counting all the ways the world could hurt his girl, and finding every one of them. So I told him what kind of place he'd walked his family into. In Ashford, a person's worth was the work they did, not the blood, or the shape, or the sex they were born to. The mercenaries who'd once robbed the roads were my captains now. The refugees who'd arrived with nothing owned their own fields. Beast folk ran trading houses here and answered to no one. I hadn't built any of that by asking what had always been done. I'd built it by asking who was good, and then getting out of their way. He wavered. But it wasn't my speech that turned him. I asked Lily, in front of him, why she wanted it. Not the polite answer, the true one. She said she wanted to make certain no one ever had to lie there, hurting the way her father had. Not while there was somebody near who knew how to help. Russell looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then something in his face gave way, and he was reaching for my hands, asking me, please, to see that his girl got her chance. I told him I would. I meant it. Whatever else I am, I keep that kind of promise. Back at the mansion, I said something I shouldn't have. I made a joke of it, that it was strange evening's work, teaching a farmer to fight for his daughter's future when my own father had signed mine away without troubling to look up from his accounts. I said it lightly. It didn't land lightly. Clara set down whatever she'd been holding. Matilda came around the chair. Neither of them said the obvious thing, that I'd never had a father worth the name. They knew I knew it. What Clara said was that my words that evening had moved her, and that whatever the Count had failed to give me, I would not go short of it here. Matilda, in her plain way, said only that they would be beside me always. I'd spent the whole day watching a man I had nearly forgotten build his ruin one bad choice at a time, and a far poorer man begged to give his child everything he had. Somewhere between the two of them, the cold thing in me had gone quiet, and this was what lay under it. I told them, honestly, that with the two of them, I didn't think I would feel lonely. It was as near as I came to saying the rest of it. But I didn't let myself sink into that either, because the season wouldn't allow it. The fire arrows were being cast 100 at a time. The salt was stockpiled. The army drilled every morning under Roland. The granaries stood full. Every calm thing I had built that winter had a second purpose, and the second purpose was always the same. Grain and iron had been climbing on the roads for months, and Roland read prices the way other men read the sky before a storm. He said war, and I believed him. It wasn't here yet, but I could feel the weight of it leaning against the door, the last quiet before the break. And so I sat up late with my wife and my oldest friend at my back, armed to the teeth, and waited for the knock I knew was coming. The knock came 2 days after the best meal of my life. I want to be honest about how good those 2 days were, because they were the last of their kind. I had spent one of them at my office window with ham and fried potato tucked into fresh bread, watching Adrian breathe below me. Over 400 people in the town now, another 100 up in the Redstone mines, all of them eating well-off land my father had handed me to die on. Matilda had said she could taste the whole territory in it. I had believed her. For the first time in my life, I had felt free, and I had been foolish enough to say so out loud. Then a knight rode in, wearing Marquis Bexley's colors, and the freedom was over. He stood in my reception room, road-worn and correct, and told us the thing the climbing grain and iron prices had been whispering for weeks. The Lonthal Kingdom was mobilizing for a full war. Their king had spent years bleeding our southwest with raids, and now he meant to come in earnest. The crown had answered. Troops would gather at the southwestern border by the end of January, the moment winter broke. The Northwest faction's year-end dinner was cancelled. In its place, a war council, and we were to arrive in uniform, not silk. I already knew the arithmetic, the way you know the shape of a thing before you're told. Lancel could field around 15,000. With the Northwest thrown in, the kingdom would raise near 23,000, and 3,000 of those would carry crossbows built to Damien's design. My little weapon had grown up while I wasn't watching. It was about to go to a war I had never wanted it in. The knight added one more thing before he bowed out to rest. The Marquis had singled me out. Special expectations, he called it, on account of my record. I did not care for those 2 words. Roland told me not to borrow trouble. The great lords chased the glory in the open field, and a minor baron like me would be tucked somewhere safe. Percy agreed, dry as ever, and said the highborn would spend themselves getting killed in the front rank while we watched. Matilda stepped in close behind my chair, one hand near her knife, and said what she always said. We will protect Lord Adrian, even at the cost of our lives. That was exactly the sentence I did not want to hear. I'm not worried about me, I told them. I don't want a single one of you to die out there. Not you, not one man from this town. Nobody had an answer to that, which was fair. I didn't have one either. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I over-prepared. A barony my size was expected to send perhaps 10 men. I would march with 30. Myself, Matilda, Roland, Percy, and 26 of our own soldiers. And I loaded the carts as if I meant to hold the border alone. 200 spare crossbows to hand out to whatever ragged conscripts got dumped beside me. Both of the ballistae Damien had built for the walls, and the fire arrows. 100 of them, sealed clay pots that broke into a sheet of flame. The ignition patterns inscribed by Daphne. The magic stones stored separate and safe. Roland watched the last crate go up and said quietly that it was a great deal of oil to bring to somebody else's war. It was. I told him the truth about why. My father had spent men the way you spent firewood. Feed them in, watch them burn, order more. I had promised myself a long time ago that I would never lead like that. So I would burn every jar of oil and every crown I owned before I ever fed one of my own people into a battle just to win it. Overwhelming force up front so that no one I loved had to be brave. That was the whole plan. That was the only plan I trusted. Down the yard, Percy chose that exact moment to lose his composure entirely. Rosetta had come out to see the carts off, and Percy, nearly 30, blunt as a hammer, a man who had turned the poor girl down flat a week ago over the age between them, got his courage up at last. He asked her, in front of half the household, to marry him when he came home. Radley groaned that promising a wedding right before a war was the worst luck a man could invite. Bart winced and agreed. Rosetta didn't care about death flags. She said yes and hugged him where everyone could see, and Percy went the color of a brick and let her. I let them have it. A man who has just decided to come home fights harder than a man who hasn't. I have never been above using that, and I did not feel bad about it. We left at first light. Clara came down the steps to see me off, and I gave her the territory, not as a gesture, as a fact. If I didn't come back, Ashford was hers to hold. The school and the mines and the granaries and every soul in Adria. She was to be the acting lord in my absence, and no one was to argue it. She didn't cry, which cost her something. She only promised, in a voice steadier than the one she'd married me with, that if the worst came, she would keep this place I had built exactly as I'd left it. So please, she said, be at ease. I don't intend to die at all, I told her, and I meant it as more than comfort. I had a family now. Men without families are the ones who spend themselves cheap. Then Clara did the thing that still surprises me when I remember it. She turned to Matilda, the beast folk companion a lesser wife would have hated, and the two of them traded vows over my head like sisters seeing a brother off. Matilda swore she would stay at my side through anything. Clara swore she would live for the territory until we both came home. I had spent 6 years of my childhood learning that warmth was a trick. Standing on those steps between the two of them, I understood I had been wrong about that. At least here, the golems took up the traces. The column rolled south. The whole town watched us go, and I did not look back at the window I used to eat lunch by, because I was fairly sure I would not be able to do it and keep my face. We joined the Conley army at Redwick and became 200 strong, 100 of Arnold's men, my 30, and the small levies of the other minor lords. Then we marched 2 weeks south, and the country changed under us. Arnold rode beside me most of it, and did not sugar the news. Small nobles like us, he said, would be handed the fortress zone, the string of forts that plugged the border, not the open field where the counts went hunting for honor. Safer. Then he lowered his voice and warned me that the South was a different country from mine. There would be harassment, he said. Be careful moving through the camps. You travel with a beast folk guard, and this is the South. I understood exactly how right he was the evening we reached the city in Marquis Goodwin's territory. It was a corpse of a town, beggars in the doorways, shops nailed shut, the life bled out of it. Our inn had been reserved in advance. The innkeeper met us at the door, saw Matilda's ears, and told me to my face that his establishment did not take beast folk. The other lords with me went hot. They had marched from the far north to defend this man's land, and they said so, loudly. I didn't raise my voice. I have learned that the cold works better than the heat, and that some walls are cheaper knocked down with money than with pride. I pressed 2 large silver coins into the innkeeper's palm and asked, mildly, whether that would be enough to let my guards sleep indoors. It was. His prejudice folded the instant it touched real coin, and he waved us in with a smile that made my skin crawl. Upstairs, in the room I'd just bought at that price, I told Matilda I was sorry. She gave me a small, tired laugh, the kind that hurts more than tears. It had just been a while, she said, since anyone had treated her that way. It brought back some old memories, that was all. I did not have a good answer for that either. What I had was a rule, and I gave it to her plainly. From here on, she did not leave my side, not for a moment, not for anyone. The army waited on the plains, and it was the largest thing I had ever seen. 20,000 men, tents to the base of the far hills and past them, more banners than I could name, whole corps of the royal army sitting in discipline blocks. I had built a town of 500 and thought myself a lord. From that hilltop, I felt about the size I actually was. I brought Matilda and Roland to report at the command tent. Marquis Bexley received us like the patron he had decided to be. And then, before I'd finished my courtesies, he warned me. The Northwest and the Southwest factions did not merely dislike each other. They camped apart and looked for reasons. And I was the only noble in the whole host who walked with a beastfolk companion at his shoulder. Never go anywhere alone with her, he told me. If a southern lord chose to make sport of it, it would get ugly fast. Deliver results, and he would not police how I carried myself, but at the very least protect what was mine. I said I would keep it in mind. I did keep it in mind. I have kept it in mind ever since. While the northern lords assembled over the next days, I fell in with Baron Ogden, who was as warm as the border was cold. He explained the shape of the army to me, how many of the soldiers were women, since magic didn't care about that, and how the beastfolk fit in. Then his round face went sad. Only the northern camp treated beastfolk as proper soldiers, he said. In the southern camp, they were disposable labor, worked hard and fed little, and the conditions there were a shame on all of us. I filed that away too. In the south, it turned out I would not have to go looking for it. Arnold came back from the war council grinding his teeth. The lords had spent more hours fighting over who led the main force than over the enemy who was actually coming. And out of that squabble fell my orders. The minor nobles were going to the forts, as promised. My fort was Barrel Fort, one of the 6 that stood right on the front line. I had said out loud more than once that I wanted a support post and no direct fighting. The council took that wish and handed me a frontline wall instead, precisely because my men carried crossbows and I could fight with golems, too useful to waste in the rear. I felt the old anger rise. The discarded son, spent again by men deciding his worth without asking him. And then I did what I have always done with that anger. I put it down and picked up the work. If they were going to hand me a fort meant to be thrown away, I would make it the one thing on that line nobody could crack. A knight strode up and called Arnold father. This was Frederick, Arnold's eldest, a knight of the elite First Corps who had volunteered for the same throwaway fort to serve beside his father's circle. He'd command. He asked me to advise and to call him plainly by his name, which told me most of what I needed to know about him. Arnold clapped us both on the shoulder, told us not to get ourselves killed, and left for his own post. Then Frederick walked me out to the men we'd been given, and I understood the joke that had been played on us. 214 beastfolk conscripts, 40 trained soldiers, my own among them, and nothing else. The Southwest had wanted its beastfolk off its hands. Bexley had wanted to hand me a body of recruits to arm. The two greeds had met, and this exhausted, underfed, badly equipped crowd was the result. Near a third of them women, all of them looking at us the way you look at one more human noble come to spend you. 2 of them came forward as representatives. Bruno, a broad lion of a man, quiet and wary, and Jonas, lean, gray-whiskered, a rat beastfolk with tired, clever eyes, who gave me his name and not 1 ounce of trust. At his shoulder stood a boy he named as his son, Kellen, watching me the way his father did. I did not blame them. I would have to earn it, and I already knew where to start. You feed people before you ask them to bleed for you. The feeding turned out to be the first fight. Frederick found it before I did. The beastfolk had come back from the depot with a fraction of what 250 people were owed. Bruno confessed the reason with his eyes on the ground. The noble handing out the rations had decided beastfolk needed only 1 meal a day to keep breathing, and had shorted them on purpose. I volunteered to go and collect the rest. I took Matilda, Roland, Percy, and both golems, and I did not bring them for the hauling. The man at the depot was Baron Dalton, and he was exactly what the South grows. He looked at my beastfolk guard and my northern colors, and made his contempt into small talk. and he told me flatly that he'd given the animals enough not to starve and saw no reason to waste good stores filling their bellies. One of his lackeys decided to make the point with his fists and swung at me. He never landed it. Matilda stepped in and took the blow on her arm guard, and the man broke his own hand on it and folded up swearing. She hadn't even drawn the knife. She didn't need to. I let the quiet sit for a moment, and then I collected the debt the only way that ever really works on men like Dalton, from above. I mentioned, without heat, that Marquis Bexley had taken a personal interest in me, and that I happened to be the son-in-law of Viscount Conley, and that if there had been some error with the rations, I would of course be obliged to raise it with the Marquis directly. Should I? I watched the arithmetic go through him. The bigotry was real, but it was cheap, and it could not survive the names I had just set on the table. He caved in a rush, admitted an error, begged me not to trouble the Marquis, and released every measure the fort was owed. We loaded the carts high and rolled them back ourselves. Bruno thanked me on behalf of all the beast folk, in a voice that had cracked something open. Roland just gave me a sidelong look and said I knew exactly what I was doing, didn't I? I did. And here is the part I never said aloud to any of them. Feeding those men was the decent thing, and feeding those men was the thing that would make them fight to the last for me instead of running at the first arrow. Both were true. I would have done it if only one of them had been. That the two lined up so neatly only meant I could stop pretending they were ever in conflict. Barrel Fort was small and well set. A single-story headquarters, a warehouse, stables, a watchtower, all ringed in stone on a gentle rise. A west gate faced Lancel and a forest. An east gate faced home. 250 of us would hold it. We relieved the little garrison that had been keeping the walls warm, and Frederick set the watch at once, with a standing rule that a senior officer stayed awake at every hour of the night. That evening, we ate together, officers and beast folk representatives at one board, and the wall between us came down a few stones. I asked Jonas what he'd do after the war. He answered without flinching, which was worse than flinching. He had gone back once to check on his village, he said. The Lancel army had already burned it, Bruno's too. Their fields, their homes, all gone. There was no life left to go back to. After the war, he'd think about it, if he was still breathing. He tipped his head toward Kellen across the room, eating with the others, and something in his tired face went soft and hopeless at once. I felt Matilda go still beside me. Her face had tightened around an old wound, and I did not have to ask which one. The South had made these men refugees before it ever made them soldiers, and she had been where they were. I said nothing. Some things you don't reach for with words. The next day, I turned that ache into work. Crossbow training began. Roland and Percy drilling the conscripts in squads of 10, teaching them to brace a foot in the stirrup and pull with the whole body, to sight down the bolt and squeeze rather than jerk. The weapon was built for exactly this. Men who had never been archers becoming dangerous in an afternoon. I watched the larger races reload faster and the smaller ones aim truer, and I started sorting them in my head into the wall I meant to build. The ballista went up assembled and ready, though 3 of the 50 explosive bolts had shattered in transit. A packing problem I made a note to solve later, if there was a later. Frederick inspected the thing and asked what it could really do. I told him the plain bolts would punch through a shield, and the explosive arrows would scatter fire across a whole cluster of men and take dozens out of a charge at once. He called it a vicious weapon, like bottling high fire magic, and he was not entirely comfortable saying it. He was right. I was not entirely comfortable owning it, but I remembered 100 sealed clay pots and the reason I'd made them, and I did not take it back. Toward dusk, a scout came in from the line. The other forts were ready. The main army's battle would open in about 3 days. 3 days. I looked west, at the dark edge of that forest where the enemy would come out of the trees, and I thought about the men behind me who had no homes left to lose, and only this wall between them and the army that had burned the last one. Frederick said we should both sleep well while we still could. I agreed with him out loud. I did not sleep much at all. The bell went at first light, 4 days after we reached Barrel Fort, and the western tree line gave up the war it had been promising us. Men poured out of the forest under Lancel banners. 500 of them, with 100 bows salted through the rest, and shook themselves into a line on the open ground below our wall. I stood on the rampart in slash-cut battle robes and a plain helmet, which made me look slightly less like a boy, and not at all like a soldier. Matilda planted herself at my shoulder in full armor, shield already up, her body angled to put itself between me and anything the enemy sent. She had decided long ago that keeping me breathing was her whole trade. I had stopped arguing about it. Frederick came along the wall and remarked that I didn't look tense. I told him I had stood on a wall like this once before, with a much larger mob trying to come over it, and that this, by comparison, looked tidy. He laughed at that. The first battle was the one that set the tone, he told me, and he was counting on the Ashford men to show what they could do. Then he went back to his own stretch of the wall and called for shields. The enemy baron did us the kindness of underestimating us. I couldn't hear him at that distance, but I could read the shape of it well enough. He looked up at a wall lined with rabbit ears and wolf ears and cat ears, decided he had been sent against rabble, and told his men the day was already theirs. Their archers loosed 100 bows, and for one breath the sky went gray with it. Most of the arrows clattered off raised shields or buried themselves in the timber. One of ours took a shaft clean through the foot and sat down hard, swearing. Down the line, Percy was shouting the beast folk steady, telling them to hold, that at this range, those shields could not be pierced, and the whole volley was for show. The nervous ones held. Then the Baron sent his line forward, and I spoke into Roland's head. We had 2 ballistas assembled just inside the gate, and a wood golem crouched at each string. Drawing a ballista is a 2-man job that a construct twice my height does alone, and faster. The enemy did not know the golem was there. They did not know the ballistas were there. They certainly did not know what we had loaded them with. I counted the closing distance and fed Roland the timing by telepathy. 10 more seconds, I told him. Then fire on your own judgment. The gate cracked open just wide enough. The golem hauled, the strings screamed, and 2 explosive arrows went out low and flat into the packed center of the charge. They burst in the middle of the formation and turned the front of it into a sheet of fire and noise. A charge is a heavy thing with a great deal of weight moving forward all at once. When the leading edge of it simply stops and burns, everything behind piles into the gap. Roughly 30 of them were out of the fight before the echo died, and the rest lost the nerve that had been carrying them. The enemy commander thought at first that a mage of impossible rank had been buried in this nothing fort. When his officers worked out it was a weapon and not a man, he ordered the charge pressed on regardless. It made no difference. Bolts came off the wall in the steady rain we had drilled. The large beast folk below, reloading and passing the crossbows up, and the charge came apart against it. His veteran read the weapons, did the arithmetic, and talked him into pulling back. He took the advice fast. When their horns dragged them off the field, we counted 4 of ours hurt and not 1 dead, against more than 100 of theirs left in the grass. Frederick called it a victory and the wall cheered. I did not. Percy stood beside me, watching the enemy fold up in good order, and said quietly that a man who ran that quick was no fool. I agreed with him. We had made the ballista look like a thing that fired only once. Next time, that lie would be worth more than the fire itself. For 2 days, they did not come. They stayed in the trees and cut timber, and any fool on the wall could see they were building shields. Their veteran had done his sums and worked out exactly what had chewed the first charge to pieces. We reloaded, counted the explosive arrows again, and waited. What came instead of an attack was a boy, a wind mage runner, the sort who can cross a day's ground between one dawn and the next, half dead on his feet when they walked him into the command room. He had come down from the north. Ledford Fort, he told us, the fort above us on the line, had fallen. Frederick took it standing. The whole fortress zone worked on one rule, that every fort held its own ground, because each one that dropped let the enemy stop worrying about it and pour everything onto the next. Ledford was gone now. That meant the men who had spent a week busy in front of it were free to come and be busy in front of us instead. Roland said what everyone already knew, that they would come back with shields, and that we had best assume the crossbow was no longer a secret. Nobody cheered anything after that. The euphoria of the first morning had curdled into something colder, and we let it. Cold was more useful. The next messenger was worse, and he was not the last. Red Fort, second from the north, had fallen too, and not to a better army. Its commander, a baronet with far more hunger for glory than sense, had led his whole garrison out of the walls to meet the enemy in the open, chasing the story of the man who breaks the line. He had nearly reached their general before they closed around him. Roland put it plainly for me. He rode out to win himself a name, got surrounded, and died buying it, and he took his fort into the ground behind him. The runner put the enemy in the zone at 5,000 or more. We had been told 3. By the following day, a second man came in at a dead run with the rest of it. Halstead, the southernmost fort, had gone the same stupid way. A garrison marched out to fight in the open and shattered. The road behind us was cut. No reinforcement was coming up that route in time, if it was coming at all. I looked at the map and did the only arithmetic that mattered. My father had spent men the way other people spend firewood, feeding them into whatever fire kept him warm, and 2 forts on this very line had just burned themselves down doing the same. Their commander commanders riding out for a name and dragging their people into the dirt behind them. I was not going to feed one of mine into that fire to buy a story, so I gave the room something else to hold instead. The enemy did not know we had dozens more explosive arrows. They did not know what my golem could do standing inside that gate, and every man in this fort had a reason to still be alive on the far side of all this. I had a wife I had married less than a year ago, and no intention of making a widow. Percy had a wedding waiting the moment the war let him go. Percy went red to the ears. Why bring that up now? Frederick, who was my brother-in-law for whatever the word was worth on a frontier wall, said it plainly then. It would be a poor thing to die when every man here had someone waiting on him. That settled the room. We were not giving up. The day after Halstead fell, they came for us in earnest, near 700 now, and this time, the front of them walked behind tall wooden shields that ate our crossbow bolts like so much rain. I worked both ballistas from inside the gate, the golem on the strings and Roland's voice in my head. We opened with the explosive arrows again, 2 of them, one into the front rank and one thrown deeper, and the fire bought a few minutes of panic. Their commander rallied them out of it, shouting that the fire weapon fired only twice and would not keep coming, driving them up the slope behind the shields. So I left the gate open. The lie was spent. The truth was better. The golem reloaded fast enough to put ordinary bolts through those shields as quick as we could crank, and a heavy bolt goes through a plank and the man behind it without slowing much. One of them found the commander's own aid instead of the commander. The man went down mid-shout, and the commander climbed off his horse and lost himself in the press where nothing could pick him out. Then they reached the wall and the ladders went up. That was the part no weapon of mine could reach. The beast folk on the wall fired down into the men on the rungs, and Roland was everywhere at once, heaving ladders off the stone, roaring at them to hold, that the first man to flinch would be the next to fall. And then an arrow came up out of the crush and found one of ours on the wall, a conscript who had trained beside me a week before, and he went down and did not rise again. Something went through the whole line when he dropped. You could feel the wall waver on the edge of breaking. Frederick and Roland caught it before it went. The big beast folk came up into the gap with everything they had. The golem held the gate and we held with it. At sunset, a trumpet called the enemy back, and they went. When the last of them was gone, I sat down with my back against the gate and found I could not stand back up. Running a golem that hard for that long empties me the way a full day of labor empties another man's arms. My body was never the weapon. It only carries the part of me that is. Matilda came and knelt beside me, sweat-soaked under her armor, and told me I had done well. I did not feel that I had. We had lost none of the Ashford 30 and none of Frederick's soldiers. We had lost beastfolk, men who had been handed a crossbow a week ago because 2 kingdoms decided their villages did not matter. 9 of them were dead by the time the count came in, and 16 more were hurt badly enough that some would never lift a weapon again. I held the grief where the wall could not see it. A commander who lets his men watch him mourn hands the enemy, the next stretch of them for free. So I kept my face still and let Matilda hold my weight and counted the living instead. The next morning, Frederick and I watched the enemy camp from the wall. It had grown larger overnight somehow, despite the 100 and more we had put down, and they were cutting still more wood from the forest. Whatever they meant to build next would be worse than shields. Below us, the fort was quiet in the wrong way. Jonas and Bruno, the 2 who spoke for the conscripts and had both been village chiefs before Lancel burned their homes to ash, were going man to man, trying to put some spine back into them. It was not taking. You cannot tell a man to die well for the kingdom that conscripted him off the ashes of his own village. Matilda said the quiet thing at my side. Tell them what waits for them if they live. So I went down and found Jonas and Bruno and made them an offer. I had asked Frederick first whether there would be any trouble in it, and he had waved it off, saying it was better they came to me than drifted loose as refugees. I told the 2 of them, and through them all of theirs, that when the war was done, they could come to Ashford, not as conscripts and not as anyone's property, but as free people, with houses, with work, with the same law over them as over any other man in my land. And I meant the ones they had hidden too, the children and the old people tucked away in the forest and the border churches, near 300 souls, all told. My territory could hold them. Jonas was wary first. He asked plainly why a noble would be this kind to beastfolk when the South had taught them exactly what that kindness usually cost. Bruno answered him before I could. When they had been starved down to 1 meal a day, this was the Lord who had walked into a supply depot and taken their rations back and called them comrades while he did it. No other noble ever had. What settled it was Matilda. She stepped up beside me and told them, in that flat, sincere way she has, that she was beastfolk herself, that she was my closest aide, and that in my house she was treated as one, with no prejudice for her blood or for being a woman. From her, it was not a promise a lord was making. It was a life one of them had already lived. Jonas asked my forgiveness for doubting me, and accepted. Bruno gripped my forearm hard enough to bruise. They went off to carry the word to the rest, and I watched it move through the yard like heat through cold iron. Men straightening where they stood, women looking up from the wounded. It was the decent thing to do. It was also the thing that would make 300 people fight to their last breath to keep me alive and get themselves home. Both were true, and I would have made the same offer if only the decency had been in it, and none of the advantage. The offer bought morale. It did not buy numbers. Within a day, the scouts put the enemy over 1,000 and still climbing, which Frederick's adjutant read the only way it could be read. The other forts up and down the line were falling, and every man who took one was funneling here to us. Someone raised the golems. I killed that idea myself. 2 constructs, however tall, do not hold off 1,000 men in the open. They would be swarmed and pulled down, and I would be left blind and spent with nothing in reserve. Percy floated, cutting off the head, taking the enemy commander so the whole camp panicked. Roland pointed out the obvious, that the man lived at the very rear precisely so that nobody could reach him. So I put a different thing on the table, a night raid, not to win the field, but to reach into their camp in the dark, set it alight, and let their own fear do the rest of the work for us. I laid it out plainly, and under the plainness, the old cold kept its patient watch, weighing what a few fires in the dark would buy against what they might cost the men who lit them. Beast folk see in the dark far better than the humans hunting them. A small team, a handful of oil jars we could crack alight with a spare explosive arrow, a few false alarms called out in the right voices, and a frightened army will do more harm to itself in an hour than we could do to it in a day. Frederick gave it his blessing. We had no time for anything cleaner, and when I asked for volunteers, knowing exactly what I was asking of them, it was Jonas and Bruno who stood first. Jonas said they had a duty to the comrades from their own villages, and that they were ready for it. His son Kellen put himself in his father's group without waiting to be asked. I told them plainly that the mission could kill them. They went anyway. That night, the dark belonged to the beast folk. Bruno took a team of 10 and more on foot, and Jonas and Kellen rode wide with another, and they crossed the open ground the way only night-eyed people can, straight at a camp that never saw them coming. 2 sentries stood watch at the near edge. Cat beast folk, tired and bored on a picket nobody expected trouble on. Bruno marked them for his crossbows, both at the same breath, no misses. They went down without a sound, and then his people were inside. They did not fight. That was the whole art of it. They threw the oil jars onto tents and stacked supplies, cracked them alight with the explosive arrows we had sent along, and the moment the first fire caught, they began to shout, in Lancel voices. The alarms an army tells itself in the dark. Enemy in the camp. Attack. Fire in the stores. An army that cannot see who is screaming answers the screaming with steel. Fires jumped from tent to tent. Men ran the wrong way into other men and drew on them. Somewhere in the middle of it, their commander was roaring for an order that would not come, swearing the food stores were safe, swearing the alarms were a trick meant to turn his own soldiers against each other. He was right about that, and it did him no good at all, because the aide who used to make his orders stick had died on our wall 2 days before. By the time they got a grip on their own camp, close to an hour had burned away. Every one of ours had already slipped back out into the dark. They came back before dawn, all of them. Bruno on foot, Jonas and Kellen on tired horses, every one of them stinking of smoke and wearing the hard grin of men who had finally hit back. I counted them twice to be sure, and let out a breath I felt I had been holding since sundown. We had won nothing that would show on a map. The enemy still sat out there past the wall, over 1,000 of them, building whatever it was they were building, but the fort still held. And the conscripts on my wall were not fighting for a kingdom anymore. They were fighting for a house with their own names on the door, 300 people's worth of it, and there is no soldier harder to break than one who has just been handed something to lose. Jonas found me on the rampart. "My people won't forget what you offered us," he said quietly. I told him to save the thanks for the day I actually delivered on it. He laughed at that, low and tired, and went to see to his son. Somewhere north of us, the relief we had been promised was supposed to be on its way. I did not yet know how close it was, or what it would cost us to still be standing on this wall when it finally came. The enemy came out of the forest behind walls of felled logs. I had been waiting for that. Explosive arrows tear a charge apart in the open. so they had learned not to give me the open. They rolled the timber forward on their shoulders, and behind it, their line came on, a slow, shielded crawl 1,000 men wide, and every one of them stayed hidden behind the wood. Roland read it the same instant I did. He leaned over the ballista string and told the crews to switch to plain bolts. We had burned through most of the explosive ones in the night raid, and the few left would waste themselves on a log wall. He said it flat, no heat in it. Conserve. I gave the order to close the gate. It came down with the sound I felt in my teeth. Then the archery started. Their shafts came up in a gray rain and caught in our shields. Ours went down into the wood and stuck there, doing nothing. Below me, the crawl kept crawling. On the far side of the gate, Percy had his own stretch of wall, and I heard him shouting the conscripts steady, telling them the enemy was loosing from under the hill, and their arrows had no reach up here. It was true enough to keep men's heads down. Matilda stood at my shoulder with her shield angled between me and the field. She did not say anything. She had stopped telling me to get down days ago. She just made herself the wall I would not build for myself. I let them come. I wanted them close. 2 nights before, I had walked my golems out into the dark and buried them in the field the enemy would have to cross, down under the turned soil, still waiting. Nobody counts the ground for enemies. You watch the walls and the tree line. You never think the dirt under your own boots is the trap. When the middle of their line was standing right on top of them, I raised my hands. The earth came apart. Both golems stood straight up out of the ground in the dead center of 1,000 men, taller than anything around them, dirt sheeting off the runework in the wood. For one breath, the whole field went silent. Then it broke. Men who had spent a week fearing the wall turned and found the wall behind them, inside them, swinging. The shielded crawl folded in on itself. The log barriers meant nothing now. They were pointed the wrong way, and the thing killing them had come up from below. I moved the golems the way I always did, hands out over the parapet, the intent running down my arms and into the wood. It empties me to run them hard. I felt the drain start almost at once, that gray pull behind the eyes, and I spent it anyway. This was what I had saved them for. Their commander saw the shape of it. I could not hear him, but I did not need to. His archers swung off the wall and up toward my position, and his mages were called to the front to burn the golems down. He wanted the puppet dead. He screamed for it, from somewhere safe in the ranks, an order for every bow to find the one small figure on the wall. Adrian, Matilda's shield came across in front of me, and an arrow rang off it. She did not look at me when she said it. She was already watching the next one. The men around me pulled in tight, shields up and overlapping into the turtle shell I had drilled them on, a shell of wood and iron with me in the middle of it. Arrows came down on it like hail on a roof. I stayed under it and kept my hands moving. The golems did not stop. That was when Jonas hit them from behind. 10 horses had gone wide through the forest in the dark, 2 beast folk to a mount, 1 to steer, and 1 to loose a short bow from the saddle. While the enemy was turned inward, screaming at the 2 things that had come out of the ground, Jonas brought his riders down on their rear where the command stood. I saw it more than heard it. A knot of good armor near the back came apart. The banners over it dipped and went down. Wherever their commander had been standing, safe behind his 1,000 men, he was not standing anymore. The order that had held them together died with the man who gave it. The whole field came unstitched at once. Without a voice at the top telling them where to go, 1,000 men became 1,000 men who each wanted to be somewhere else. I turned the golems to cover the riders and told Roland to give them everything the walls had. Ballista bolts and crossbow fire went out over the retreating horses and cut a lane home for them. The riders came back around the flank at a hard gallop, low over their mounts' necks, and the gate cracked open just enough to swallow them. We had done it. 200 of us against 1,000, and we had broken them and killed the man who owned them, and the ones still alive out there were running. I remember thinking we had won. I remember the men on the wall starting to shout it. I let the golems slump, and the drain took me down to one knee against the stone, empty, grinning like a fool, and I thought the worst of the day was behind us. The riders came into the yard, and I went down to meet them, still shaky, still smiling. They were dismounting slow, too slow. Men who had just won do not move like that. They move loud. These men moved like they were carrying something, and then I saw that they were. Jonas had taken an arrow in the back, somewhere in the retreat, riding home through the fire he had helped start, and no one had known. There is no way to know, in a running fight, which of the men bent low over their horses is bent low because he is dead. They found him when they stopped. He was already gone. He had been gone for a while. They laid him down in the yard, and I stood over him, and the smile was still on my face, and I could not get it off. Kellen knelt by his father. He did not cry out. He put a hand flat on the old man's chest, the way you would to wake someone, and then he took it away because there was nothing to wake. Frederick came and stood beside the boy, and I heard him say it low, that Jonas was a hero, that we had our victory because of him, that he was proud to have stood on the same wall. Thank you, Kellen answered him. His voice did not break. My father would be glad to hear that. I could not say anything at all. I had drawn the plan. 3 parts, clean on the paper. The raid, the golems out of the ground, the riders at the rear. The rear was the part that won it. The rear was the part with no wall around it. I had known when I drew it that the riders would be in the open longest, and I had drawn it that way anyway because it worked and it had worked, and this was what it cost. Matilda touched my arm. She said something. I told her I was only tired. I told her I wanted to go back to my room and rest a while, and my voice came out steady, and I hated how steady it was. I went inside and I did not come out. I sat on the edge of the cot in the dark and did the arithmetic I could not stop doing. 9 dead on the wall the week before, and more wounded than I could count. And now Jonas, who had come to me a stranger and a conscript and asked forgiveness for doubting me, who had thanked me for a house he would never live in. I had promised his people a home. He had gone out and bought it for them and had not come back to see it. I had told myself I was ready for this. Command means men die, and the ones who give the orders learn to carry it. I had said that to myself in a calm voice more than once, the way you rehearse a thing so it will be true when you need it. It was not true. I sat there and found out it had never been true. I had just never lost one I liked before. Matilda came in without a word and sat down beside me and took my hand. She did not tell me it was not my fault. She was too honest for that, and she knew I would not have believed her. She only held on. After a long time, she said, quiet, that she was there to help me live a happy life, and that she was not going anywhere. I held her hand and looked at the dark, and let the grinning idiot who thought he had won finally go quiet inside me. Somewhere out past the wall, the enemy was still there. I knew that. I could not make myself care about it yet. Roland came the next morning, and Kellen came with him. I did not want to see the boy. I could not have said no to him. He stood in the doorway with his father, a day dead, and asked if he could speak to me, and I made myself look at him instead of at the floor. He told me his father's last words. At the end, Kellen said. Before the raid, he told me something. He said, live happily under our Lord. He stopped, steadied himself, went on. He meant you. He wanted me to hear him say it while he still could. The boy's hands were shaking and his voice was not. Thank you, Adrian. Truly, my father spent his whole life with nothing to hope for, and you gave him some at the end of it. You gave it to me. Whatever happens now, we won't forget that. I had braced for blame. Blame I would have known how to take. This I did not. When Kellen had gone, Roland stayed. He is not a soft man, and he did not try to be one. He said he had lost men when he was a mercenary, more than he would count out loud, and he had learned one thing about it that I needed to hear. A lord cannot promise his people they will not die. No one can promise that. It is a lie the moment you say it. What a lord can give them, the one thing that is really his to give, is hope. Jonas had died with it. Most men in this world never got to. You gave him that, Roland said. Don't you dare decide now that it was worth nothing. That's the one way you can actually fail him. I sat with that a while. Then I stood up. Jonas had died believing his people had a homecoming. The only thing I could do for a dead man was make the thing he died believing in true. Grief was not going to do that. Getting up was. I thanked Matilda. I told Roland I would be back on the wall within the hour, and I meant it. They did not break and run for good. I had thought a beheaded army would scatter. Instead, it took them 3 days to argue out a new commander, and when they came back 1,500 strong. More men fed into the fight from wherever the rest of the war was going badly. 1,500 against the 200 of us still able to stand. Something was wrong with that. No sane force spends that hard for one small fort at the end of nothing. They wanted this ground for a reason I did not have yet, and I meant to get it. They had learned about the golems too. When I sent the wood out this time, they answered with fire arrows, fire magic, a spell that bloomed orange against the tree line, and wood burns. I pulled the golems back behind the wall before they could be turned into torches. That took my heaviest card off the table and left us with crossbows and stone and whatever else I could invent. So I invented something ugly. 200 people packed into a fort make a great deal of waste, and we kept it in barrels by the latrines to burn. I had those barrels hauled up to the wall over the gate where the enemy had massed thickest to force it, and we tipped them. There was no laughing in it. A month ago, I might have laughed. Now I just watched the reeking mess come down on the men at the gate and watched their charge come apart in it. Men slipping and gagging and losing the wall of their own bodies. and I felt nothing but the cold arithmetic of it working. It bought us the gate for another hour. In the mess of it, I saw a man in a noble's plate directing the others, close under the wall. I told Roland through the link between us to have a golem reach down. A wooden hand came over the parapet and plucked the noble up out of his own front rank and hauled him in over the wall before anyone could put fire to it. Roland put him to sleep with the flat of a fist. We had a prisoner, and prisoners talk. The enemy pulled back, shaken, and left us the day. We stripped the plate off him, sat him down, tied him, and woke him with a cup of water in the face. Frederick judged from the armor that he was a baron or a viscount, high enough to know things. He came up defiant. He sneered that taking a hostage was a coward's move, that killing him would not stop the Lancel advance, that we could kill him if we dared. He had steeled himself for pain. That was the mistake. I did not touch him. I had no need to and no wish to. I sat down where he could see me, and I laid it out plainly, in the flattest voice I had. He was alone. He was disarmed. No one was coming for him. The story of how a wooden hand had reached down and lifted a Lancel noble out of his own ranks was already loose in his camp, and there was nothing he could do to call it back. That alone had cost his side something. And these defenders he had been throwing men at for 2 weeks did not fight by any rule he knew. He had no idea what we would do next, and that not knowing was doing my work for me. Set against staying alive and walking out on his own feet, I told him, pride was a cheap thing to spend. It did not take long. He was afraid of the wrong thing. He had prepared for a blade, and I never showed him one. And the quiet was worse. He talked. 18,000 men he gave us. 10,000 holding the main field works. 8,000 peeled off to take the fortress zone, and our little fort sat square in the throat of it. If we fell, the whole main army could be turned. That was why they would not stop coming. I had him fed, gave him back enough dignity to walk, and sent him out the gate on his own legs to carry the story home himself. Frederick watched me do it and did not like all of what he saw. Later, he asked if it was wise, letting a noble go. Then he said the other thing, the one he had been holding. Since Jonas died, he said, I had changed. I had always fought by my own rules, but now there was no break on me at all. Maybe he was right. I told him what was true. My father spent men like firewood, fed them into the cold to buy himself a story, and I had watched 2 forts on this same line burn themselves down, doing exactly that for exactly that reason. I was not going to spend my people that way. I was going to get every man I had left home alive, and I would do whatever it took short of cruelty to do it. And if that made me cold, then I would be cold. Frederick did not have an answer for that. I think it was because he could not find the part of it that was wrong. After that, the enemy stopped coming to the wall. They had learned to fear what happened when they got close, so they stood off and worked us from range. Arrows, fire spells, day after grinding day. We answered with what we had, crossbows and ballistas, and the golems hurling their own weapons back, and slowly it stopped being a battle and became a subtraction. After a week, we were nearly out of everything. Bolts low, explosive arrows all but gone. Food gone enough that I said out loud we might have to slaughter the horses for meat, and watched Frederick flinch at how plainly I could say it. 2 more days. I gave us 2 more days. On the edge of the second day, a lookout called riders in the south. I dragged myself up to the wall with Frederick, half sure it was more of them come to finish it, and looked where the man was pointing. A column of horse, 200 strong, coming up the southern road at speed. Roland stared a long moment, and then said the word I had stopped letting myself hope for. Allies. Frederick knew the armor at the front of them. Count Marcus. And Marcus riding here, cavalry loosed and pointed at us, could mean only one thing. The main army had won its battle on the plains, and the men who had been holding it were free to come north and break the siege off our throat. The riders did not slow at the enemy. They hit the Lancel flank at a full charge, into a force that had spent 2 weeks facing a wall and never once thought to guard its side. It came apart the way the first line had come apart in the field, only there was no reforming from this. Frederick turned and shouted our victory down into the yard, and the whole exhausted fort came off the ground roaring. I put what we had left into it, every bolt, every last ballista shot, out into the breaking enemy so they could not turn and reset against the horse. Between the cavalry in their flank and the wall at their front, the 1,500 stopped being an army. They ran. I watched them run and felt the 2 weeks come down on me all at once. I gave the order to shift the ballistas aside from the gate and let the riders in. Count Marcus rode in like a man who had come to inspect us, not save us. He found Frederick first and spoke with him, all soldier, and then his eye fell on me, and the temperature of him dropped. He made it plain he had no love for me. I had known that since a banquet a year gone, when he called my crossbows an insult to a knight's honor. He told me flatly he had not come to save me. These were Marquis Bexley's orders, and he would have ridden past if he could. Then, grudging, like it was being pulled out of him with a rope, he said it anyway. "Well done, Baron." I thanked him and told him I owed him my life all the same. I did not say the rest of what I was thinking. Let him keep his pride. He had just spent it on the flank charge that kept my men breathing, and I was not going to argue a man out of a thing that had saved us. Then the relief took the fort off our hands. Fresh troops on the wall, supply wagons through the gate, food. For the first time in over a week, there was no next hour to survive into. That night, I let go of a thing I had been holding for 2 weeks without knowing I was holding it. Through all of it, I had kept a hard line between the man who gave the orders and the man who felt anything, because the man who felt things would have gotten someone killed. With the wall someone else's problem now, I let the line go. Matilda cleaned the grime off both of us and sat down beside me and did not object when I put my arms around her and did not let go. I fell asleep like that, holding on to the one warm, certain thing I had, and for once, I did not dream about the yard. 2 days later, they pulled us back to a rear camp and gave me the count. 34 dead, 33 of them beastfolk conscripts, one a kingdom soldier of Frederick's. The beastfolk had come to this war in whatever they could scavenge, no armor worth the name, and the arrows had found them for it. My own Ashford men had come out without a single death, every one of them carried through it by good gear, and the golem at their backs. I sat with that count a long while. I would not pretend it balanced. 33 men had died wearing rags because no one had ever thought their lives worth a coat of mail. I could not give them that back. I could give the ones still standing the thing I had promised. There were 180 of them left alive, most carrying a wound, and out past the line, their families were waiting. Old ones and children they had hidden in forests and churches, near 70 more souls. I sent Kellen and Bruno to gather them. All of them were coming home with me to Adria. Free settlers, houses, and work, and the same law as any man. The home Jonas died believing in, made real for his son and his people. I had brought coin enough for the road and could advance the rest against the reward the crown owed these men, and I would. Frederick came to say goodbye. He told me his father had to stay on for the post-war work, so I would march home on my own. Then he told me something that stayed with me. Along the whole front line, only 2 forts had held. Ours was one. The other had been carried by a single very skilled mage, and Frederick guessed we might meet the man someday at a royal reward ceremony. Both of us called up to be thanked by the crown. I turned that over. 2 forts out of all of them, and one of them was mine, the discarded son, the boy his father dumped on trash land to die, holding a wall the kingdom would remember. My father still did not know I was alive. He was going to find out the hard way, and not today, and not from me begging at his door. He would find out because the whole kingdom was about to start saying my name. Frederick and I shook hands and agreed to meet again next year. Then I turned to the men who had chosen me, Roland, Percy, Matilda, and behind them, the ones who were left. "Our work here is done," I said. "Let's go home." The road home ran clear the whole way, and part of me kept waiting for that to turn into a lie. No monsters in the shallow country, no bandits on the passes. The war had scoured the land ahead of us clean, and it felt less like luck than like the world holding its breath. Behind me stretched a column near 300 long, my own soldiers first, then the horse golem hauling the cart, then the beast folk who had come out of the war with nothing but the promise I had made them. Wounded on the wagons, children walking between the wheels, old fighters who had watched their villages burn and had decided, somewhere in the fighting, that they would rather follow me than go on being no one's people. Matilda kept at my side the way she always did, one hand near her knife, even here, on an empty road with nothing left to fight. I did not tell her to stop. Somebody in this family should still expect the worst. Kellen walked up near the front more often now. His father had led these people. Jonas had died believing his son would get the home I swore to build, and every mile north was a mile closer to me making that true or making myself a liar. I did not let the thought sit long. Grief was a weight you carried on one shoulder and kept walking. Put it down, and it never came back up clean. So I did the arithmetic instead, because arithmetic was the one thing that never lied to me. I was going home a name the kingdom had started to say. Somewhere far to the south, a man sat in a house that was quietly coming apart. Craftsmen fled, coffers thinning, his faction slipping a rung a year. I filed it the way I filed everything about him and wrote on. 3 days later, the plane opened, and there it was. Adria, my capital, bigger than the town I had left. Percy had ridden ahead to carry word, so the streets were already full when we came through the gate. They lined the road on both sides. Shopkeepers, farmhands, the beast folk who had come before the war, and the humans who had learned to live beside them. They were not cheering a lord who had bought them. They were cheering because the man who built the place they lived in had come back alive. And there is a difference, and I had spent my whole life learning to tell it. Clara waited at the manor steps in full formal dress, the lady of Ashford receiving her lord. She gave me the greeting the whole street needed to see. "Welcome home, my lord," spoken clear and steady. A woman who had held my territory for months and wanted no one to doubt she could. Then the doors closed behind us, and she was just Clara, and the steadiness went out of her all at once. She held on to me and did not care who was still in the hall to see it. She had been so afraid, she told me, and she had never let it show, not once, not to anyone. She had chaired the meetings and read the ledgers and sent the orc hunt out and smiled through all of it, and then gone up alone every night to a bed that used to hold 3 and cried where no one could hear and come down in the morning steady again. "You held everything," I told her. "You did what I couldn't have." Matilda stood close, and Clara reached out and pulled her in too, the 3 of us in a knot in the front hall. Percy came in behind us with Rosetta on his arm, grinning like a man who had won an argument with the whole world, and for a moment I let myself simply be a person who had come home, before I remembered I was a lord and there was work. The first real report told me the home had held itself. While I was at the fort, orcs had come out of the deep forest and taken a ore convoy on the road. Radley gave it to me flat, the way he gave everything. He and Bart had gone out with better than 30 men, soldiers, and beastfolk laborers together. They had baited a pair of the things into the open, dropped the smaller one with the ballista, and put the bull down with crossbow bolts coated in angel's honey, the sedative resin, the thing that lets you take a monster without a slaughter. It had gone slow, and it had gone hard. "Bart caught a club," Radley said, and tipped his head at the arm in its sling. "Broke the arm. Nobody died." Bart lifted the sling an inch and gave me his easy grin. "It was nothing," he swore. Michelle had already scolded him worse than the orc had. I looked around the table at the people who had done this without me. Radley, who owed me nothing and had ridden out anyway. The laborers who had picked up crossbows to defend land that was finally, truly theirs. My father had spent a lifetime buying loyalty and never once owned any. I had left my territory in other people's hands, and it had closed like a fist around the threat and held. That was the whole argument of my life, proven in one convoy road. I said the plain thing, "Good work, all of you," and meant it more than the words could carry. Settling near 300 people is not a ceremony. It is land and work and food, and doing it all before winter. We did it. The beast folk who had followed me home got what beast folk got nowhere else in this kingdom. Plots of their own, wages for the clearing, and the same law over their heads as everyone else. Dominic's crews and the newcomers themselves threw up a whole district on the north edge of town, timber frame after timber frame, and I walked it with Matilda while the hammering went on around us. Kellen met me at the half-built row that would be his people's street. He thanked me, and there was none of the wariness his father had carried into that fort, the look that expected every human kindness to have a hook in it. "You have carried this well," I told him. "Your father would know it was worth it." He held that a moment, jaw tight, and then he bowed and got back to the work, which was the only answer worth anything. Roland came through with his boy up on his shoulders, Jacob, barely more than a year, and already talking, shouting welcome home at his father a week after his father had come home. May ran the women's association that fed and housed the newcomers' families, and Roland had gone home to both of them the first night back, and, by the look of him, slept for a day. Watching him carry his son past the frames of houses for a people who had almost had no future at all, I thought about a rat beast folk man on a fort wall who had told his own son to live happily under our Lord, and then died in the charge that won the battle. Jonas never saw this street. He had believed in it anyway, believed it hard enough to spend his life on it, and here it was, going up in green timber, roof by roof, a whole people who would grow old somewhere safe because of a hope he did not live to collect. I had made the dead man's hope true. It was the only thing left I could still do for him, so I did it, and I did not let it stop at one street. The fields told the same story in green, wheat and potato, and soybean coming up thick. The harvest that fed a territory that had passed 1,000 people while I was away. 1,000. Adria was not a settlement anymore. It was a city, and I had watched it be nothing but death forest and one man's stubbornness 4 years back. At the clearing line, the big beast folk were felling trees toward the western river. Bruno straightened when he saw me and reported it plain. They had cut all the way to the water. He said a thing I did not forget, that in the southwest, a lord would never have said what I had just said to him. A simple word of thanks. I only nodded. The bar had been set so low for these people that decency read as generosity, and I meant to keep clearing it. Zane ran the farmland now. He had come to me a discarded laborer years ago, and I had promised him then that once he was settled, I would help him build a family. He had fought the orcs while I was gone, and taken no wound and asked for no credit, and he had married a tiger beast folk woman who came north as a free settler. The wages have everyone working glad, he told me, deflecting the praise sideways. And my marriage goes well. Thank you, my lord. A promise made to a laborer with nothing, kept early. Back in town, Damien had already torn into the new golem gear. Thicker plate, a shield and ram to punch a line, a short blade slung under the crossbow so a man never got caught between shots. Percy and Rosetta had moved into a house of their own. Everywhere I looked, someone I had picked up off the bottom of the world was building something on top of it. Not everything closed clean. Radley came back from the forest with the answer I half expected and did not like. No clear cause. No nest. No obvious reason for orcs to keep pushing to my border twice in 2 years when once a decade was strange. Just a run of bad luck, near as we can tell, he said. And then, because he was honest, added that his men had only walked the shallows. Nobody sane went into the deep forest. Something down there in the dark might be pushing things out toward my land, and we had no way to know. I told him to raise the patrols and set it aside. A lord who chases every shadow into the deep woods dies in the deep woods. The good news walked in behind the bad. Christy set a small dish in front of me and could barely keep the pride off her face. Beet sugar, real, white, clean. The kind of luxury that turned a frontier barony's ledgers black all on its own. She talked me through the burnt shell trick that pulled the impurities out, laughing that Damien had forgotten to build the press the whole time I was at war, and somehow finished it on schedule anyway. I tasted it. It was sugar. Buy beets from outside the domain, I told her. Don't wait 3 years to grow into it, and clear the ground for more. She had earned her place 10 times over. She was nearly ready to be freed of her bond and made a full squire, and I let her go off glowing while I made the note. Then, a royal knight rode into Adria with a sealed letter, and the ordinary day stopped. Percy escorted him to me himself. In the council room, the others waited, shut out, guessing. Roland called it early. War rewards, he told the room, and land would be too much for a man in my position, so watch for something else. Bart wanted to know if it was gold. Clara came to the door and confirmed it was the war and the crown, and set them all buzzing. I let them wait a breath longer than I needed to, because I'm not made of only good habits. And then I told them I had been raised to baronet, titled nobility, by the king's own patent, for holding one of the 2 forts on the whole line that did not fall. Clara's guess and Roland's landed at once, and the room came apart into the kind of noise a family makes. I stood in the middle of it and felt 2 things at the same time, both of them true. This was good for my people. A titled lord drew protection and standing that a frontier baron could only dream of, and everything I had built got safer the higher I climbed. And it was a stone laid quietly on a ledger I had kept since I was 15 and thrown out on trash land to die. The caged bastard now held a crown's patent of rank, moving into the same titled world as the man who had thrown him away, while that man's house thinned and slipped, and rotted from the inside a little more each season. I had not seen his face yet. I had not said a word to him, but the letter did not only make me a baronet, it called me to the capital. I looked at the seal a while and thought that the distance between us was finally closing, and that when it closed, it would close on my schedule, not his. We ride for the capital, I said. The royal letter had come sealed in wax the size of my palm, and 3 days later, I was drinking my mother-in-law's tea, while my father-in-law told me how to stand in front of a king. He's young and full of fire, Arnold said, turning his cup by the handle. Carries the dignity a crown ought to carry, and he likes to be seen being generous. Give him room to be generous, and he'll like you. Clara leaned in. She was going to be presented too, and I could see the question sitting behind her eyes before she asked it. And he won't mind, Matilda? A beast folk companion in his hall? He won't blink. Eleanor set the pot down. I met him myself, a tolerant man, and proud of being one. You'll be treated as any other noble in that room. Matilda stood a pace behind my chair, ears turned to every word, saying nothing. She had learned long ago that the safest place in any garden was just outside the conversation. Arnold started laughing then, and told me that a self-made frontier lord and a young reforming king might end up friends. I told him I'd rather not, and meant it, and he said that was exactly the sort of thing that made kings curious. He talked me through the rest of it. 30 of us would be honored this year, but only 2 raised in rank, myself and a southern baronet named Griffin Rosbrook, an earth mage who had held a fort almost alone and would leave the capital a baron. I liked the sound of him without having met him. A man who held a wall by himself understood something most of these people never would. Then Arnold mentioned, lightly, the way you mention weather, that Count Maximilian of Vance would almost certainly attend the banquet. I kept my face where it was. I set my cup down without a sound, but something must have moved under it, because Clara's hand came across the table and rested on the back of mine. "You," she said quietly. "Are you all right?" Far from painful. I turned my hand over and let her hold it. I have waited a long time to let that man watch me walk into a room. It came out colder than I wanted, warmer too. There was an old ache under the cold I hadn't given permission to speak, the plain childish hurt of a boy who had been thrown away and had never quite finished being surprised by it. No amount of building erased it. It only gave it somewhere to stand. Clara didn't let go of my hand. Neither of her parents pretended they hadn't heard, and I drank my tea and smiled and let them believe I was steadier than I was. I left my old soldiers at home. That decided itself. Roland and the men who had come to me out of banditry had once crossed swords with my father's knights and lived, and a capital full of Vance retainers was no place to remind anyone of it. So I took steadier guards with clean histories, gave Adria over to careful hands, and turned the carriage south with Clara and Matilda for the long roll to the capital. 2 weeks on the road. The towns near the northwest were fat and untroubled, but the further south we went, the more the war showed. Bread priced like silver, iron priced like gold, faces that had spent a year being afraid. Clara watched a thin market go by and said it was sad, even if nothing could have been done. I told her potatoes might mend some of it, that a crop that grew in poor dirt could put food under a lot of empty roofs. I did not tell her the Northwest would sit on that crop as long as sitting on it paid. She had grief enough for the view. She didn't need my arithmetic on top of it. The last time I had made this road, I was 15, half-starved, riding a golem-drawn cart with Matilda and nothing else in the world. Matilda's ears flicked when the city came up over the horizon, and I knew she was counting the same years I was. The capital did not so much appear as arrive. Kingsholm, 150,000 souls behind a wall that ran to the edge of sight, a castle on the height, a whole quarter given over to nobles who could afford to keep a house they slept in twice a year. Clara pressed close to the window and said that as a girl she had only seen it twice, and that a grown woman saw how enormous it really was. We came through the noble district to the Conley Villa in the gold end of the afternoon. Eleanor had gone ahead and was waiting at the door, brisk and warm, herding us in out of the road dust before we could bow. Rooms ready, baths drawn, and her husband already out paying the calls that ran this city long before any ceremony did. A week early, the Crown sent for me. Arnold rode over with me and told me on the way not to knot myself up. They had asked for the meeting, not us. That made us guests, and guests could afford to be gracious. I put on the face I keep for rooms like this, pleasant, unbothered, a smile with nothing behind the eyes, and let a footman walk us in. Marquis Godfrey Bexley was already seated. So was the man we had come for, Count Burke, Minister of Military Affairs, sharp as a good knife and twice as polite. He came to it without much circling. The royal family, he said, would be honored to receive from Ashford a gift, crossbows, ballistas, the explosive bolts, and the seed potatoes, and the knowledge to make them, a gift. I heard it for what it was under the courtesy, a command with a bow tied on it. Refuse and I would spend the rest of my life explaining the refusal. I find this a most honorable offer, I said, and let gratitude sit warm on every word. I would gladly present them, and give what little I can for the royal house. The terms came out plainly enough. 100 crossbows, 4 ballistas, 50 of the explosive bolts, and a wagon's weight of seed potatoes, with the making of each written down alongside, by year's end, which meant a rider had to leave for Adria in the morning. Bexley added, easy as a man laying down a winning card, that His Majesty had granted the Northwest need not share any of it with the rival factions. So the Crown took my edge, and my faction kept it from everyone but the Crown. I could live with that shape. I gave the Crown its weapons. Then I started collecting. I asked first for Damien, that his name be set in the kingdom's own histories and taught in its military academies as the man who built these things. Burke agreed without a blink. It cost him nothing and bought loyalty cheap. It would cost me nothing either, and it would make an odd, brilliant blacksmith the happiest man in the North. Good for the Crown, good for my armory, good for a friend. Every reason pointing the same way for once. Then Burke asked what I wanted for myself. I let the question sit. I set my hands still, and I asked him quietly whether he knew where I came from, whose son I was, and how that man had come to have a son out on the frontier at all. His eyes changed, not much, just enough to tell me he was no longer weighing a single crate of crossbows, but a man, and what a man like that might be owed. I left the hook in the water and said no more. The reward I wanted was not one you asked for in front of a marquise. It was one you set up, a week at a time, until the day it was simply there. They called us one at a time, in order of rank, so the lower nobles waited together in a long, quiet room with fruit water going warm in glass cups. That was where I finally met Griffin Rosbrook. There was no mistaking him, a head over every other man in the room, a good 6.5 feet of him, red hair, hands that looked built to move stone because they were. He had put a fort on his back and carried it through a war, and he stood there in a fine coat, looking faintly like he'd rather be anywhere with fewer people in it. We traded the few words two men trade when they've each done the impossible, and would rather not discuss it. He asked in about a dozen words whether the crossbows were as good as the stories. I told him better, and that I'd rather have his wall than my luck any day. Something in his jaw eased. He didn't smile, exactly. He just decided, visibly, that I was tolerable, which from a man like that was a warm embrace. Then a herald said his name, and the tall man went in ahead of me to be made a baron. Then it was my turn, and I walked the length of a room, nearly as long as my entire house, to kneel in front of the king. I said the words Arnold had drilled into me, and said them cleanly. King Oscar was every bit as advertised, young, quick, wearing his dignity like a well-cut coat and enjoying the fit. He read the decree off costly parchment, named the fort I had held, and raised me from knight to baronet, and a page set a purse of crowns in my hands, heavy enough to feel like a joke, after everything it had cost to earn. Then he looked at me a moment longer than the ceremony asked for. "You seem more ordinary," he said, than I was led to expect. The whole hall was listening. I looked up at him and answered plainly, "I know full well I'm an oddball, Your Majesty. I also know exactly how a man is meant to behave in company. I simply choose the odd road when I can afford it." He laughed at that, a good laugh, a shade too large for the joke, thrown out for the room to catch. A practiced faker of smiles knows another one across a hall. I gave him back the courtesy of pretending it was spontaneous, and he gave me the courtesy of deciding he liked me. Kings and I were going to have that kind of friendship, apparently, whether I wanted it or not. I rose a baronet, titled nobility, the same thin air my father had breathed my whole discarded life. I walked back down that long, bright room with the purse in my hand, and thought, without heat, that the distance between his world and mine had just closed to the width of a single banquet hall. Before the banquet, I found Clara and Arnold in a side gallery, and Clara was wound tight as a bowstring. We went over it quickly and quietly. The tie between me and the Count of Vance was not widely known. A bastard son dumped on a death forest was not the sort of story a proud house told about itself. We agreed the floor was no place to change that. No open quarrel, no scene. Let the evening be an evening. After holding a wall, I told her, getting lost in a crowd of 200 is a holiday. Breathe. Stand next to your mother. Let me do the talking. Eleanor took Clara's arm, the way a seasoned hand takes a nervous horse, and promised to steer her through the greetings. Some of the color came back into Clara's face. The herald announced us, and we came into the hall as a household, and the room turned to look. I was used to that. My name pulled a little tale of rumor behind it wherever it went. The oddball, the crossbow, the golems, the one who kept a beastfolk companion at his shoulder in polite society. That last one earned the whispers. I heard a few of them curdle as I passed, the sort of small ugliness that thinks itself too refined to be heard. I let it slide straight off. A year ago, it might have found a nerve. Now I had a marquise at my back, a faction under me, and a purse from the king still warm in my memory, and the opinion of a man who sneered at Matilda weighed exactly nothing on any scale I cared about. Clara and Eleanor crossed to the ladies' side of the hall with a guard at their heels, and I watched them go safely before I turned to the men's side with Arnold. So far, the evening was only an evening. I let myself believe it might stay one. Then I felt it. Across the whole width of that crowded hall, through 200 people and the music and the candle heat, something reached me and pressed on the side of my face like a cold hand. Hate. Old, patient, personal hate, aimed with the accuracy of long practice. Matilda felt it the same instant. Her ears turned before I did. She leaned in close, barely moving her lips. "To your left, Lord Adrian." I looked. He was older than the man I carried in memory. The rich clothes were the same, and the set of the mouth was the same, and the contempt was exactly the same, but it was pointed the wrong way now. All my life, that face had looked at me the way a man looks at something the servants forgot to throw out. It was looking at me that way still, only now there was fear stitched underneath it. The small, sick fear of a man watching the thing he discarded walk into the king's own hall, wearing a title he had just been given by the king's own hand. He didn't cross to me. He didn't say a word. He never had needed words to tell me what I was worth to him. He only stood there in his fine coat and burned. I held his eyes across all that distance. I did not bow. I did not look away. I let one small, cold smile show, just for him, just long enough for him to be certain he had seen it. And then I smoothed my face back to a pleasant nothing and turned my attention to the wine as if he were a stranger who had glanced at me by accident. That smile was the only shot I fired all night, and I kept it small on purpose. Everything I had came up behind it, hot and ready, and I held every ounce of it down. Not here, not tonight, not on his cue, in a borrowed room, where a scene would only make me look like the wild bastard the story wanted me to be. I had waited 9 years. I could hold for a few more days. Arnold had gone still at my shoulder. He had followed my eyes and understood the whole of it in a breath. He murmured, low under the music, that the Vance house had been quietly rotting for a while now. The good craftsman gone north. The coffers thinner than the old name. The whole thing slipping a rung a year. He told me not to pick the fight myself. A house sinking on its own didn't need a push. It needed a witness. I told him I could be very patient when the ending was worth it. I picked up my wine and let the banquet close back over the moment. To every eye in that hall, we were two nobles who had never met. Only the two of us knew that a debt 9 years old had just come into the same room and looked itself in the face for the first time, and that nothing about it was settled, nothing at all. The whole thing still stood between us, wound tight and waiting. One move from breaking. He was in the room now, and the room was not nearly big enough for both of us. He was across the hall from me, and he had already found my face in the crowd. I lifted my glass a half inch, the way a man salutes a stranger he has no reason to know, and I let the smile touch my mouth and nothing else. My father did the same. We were two polite noblemen acknowledging each other over a sea of silk and candlelight, and not one person between us could have guessed that the last time we stood in the same room, he had signed me over to a forest full of monsters and gone back to his dinner. Nobody here knew he was my father. That was the whole pleasure of it. He came from the storied southeast. I was the northern upstart in the well-cut coat. Different regions, different ranks, no reason on paper for our eyes to keep finding each other across a banquet floor. So the room saw two strangers. Only the two of us felt the wire pulled tight between them. I could have crossed the floor right then. I didn't. A man who lets his face crack in a public hall hands the other man the advantage, and I had spent too long earning my footing to give it away for the price of a sneer. He wanted me to be angry. Anger would have made me the bitter bastard son making a scene, and made him the gracious count enduring it. No, I had waited 9 years for him to stand in a room and watch me be happy. A few more minutes standing in it cost me nothing. Matilda kept close at my shoulder, reading the crowd the way she always did, one part of her never quite off duty. I turned from my father like a man turning from a painting he had finished looking at. Let's go, Matilda. Yes, Lord Adrian. Behind me, I felt his stare stay fixed on my back, and I let it. Let him look. Let him do the arithmetic all night. The son he threw in a ditch, wearing the king's honor, and no way in the world to say so out loud. Arnold steered me toward the Northwest's own, Marquis Godfrey Bexley, silver-streaked and in high spirits, holding court near the windows with another marquis at his side. Bexley greeted me like a man showing off a prize colt. The court was still talking about my bearing at the ceremony that morning, he said, pleased as if he had raised me himself. Arnold stood a half step back and let himself be proud out loud. His son-in-law, a baronet now, and he could not have been prouder if he'd tried. The marquis beside him was Goodwin, head of the southern faction, smaller than his reputation and quiet with it. He returned my greeting with perfect courtesy. Then his eyes went to Matilda, to the rabbit ears set atop her black hair, and narrowed for just a breath before he smoothed his face over. It was the look I'd learned to catalog years ago. The man doesn't hate you, exactly. He simply files you under a different heading than himself. He apologized in advance for any offense, all silk, and I gave him nothing to hold on to. I made the bow full and correct, and he allowed that I had good manners for someone so young. A touch eccentric, he added, but a fine noble all the same. I kept the pleasant mask on and filed him away too. To move things along, Goodwin waved over the tall young man drifting at the edge of his group, Griffin Rosbrook, the hero of the South, the other name the court had been passing around all week. He was a full head over everyone near him, well past 6.5 feet, crimson hair and clear green eyes, and he wore his fine coat like it had been buttoned onto him by force. We shook hands. Two celebrated war heroes, introduced with a flourish, and then left to actually speak to each other. It went about as well as two stones make conversation. He told me, in as few words as he could manage, that he'd heard I held my fort nearly alone, and that he was impressed. I said the honor was mine, and asked how he'd held his. The gods gave him a knack for earth magic, he said. It had been a hard fight, but mostly he'd just kept burying the enemy under the ground. I said that sounded efficient. He agreed that it was. A silence opened up like a trench. I cast about and landed on his height, and offered that being so tall must carry the odd hazard of low door frames. He considered this with real gravity, and admitted that yes, he did sometimes catch his head on a low door. Then we both stood there, two men who had commanded hundreds, and could not for our lives command a dinner party conversation, silently praying for someone to interrupt. I wished hard that Arnold would come rescue me. Whatever else the evening held, I already knew this quiet giant, and I were never going to be friends. We simply weren't built to fit the same sentence. The king and queen opened the dinner properly then, a standing feast without dancing, meant to honor the war's heroes and the men who'd built quietly at home. The honored came forward to pay respects in the order of their awards. The two marquises first, then Count Marcus, then on down the line until it was my turn. Clara came up beside me, and I felt her nerves in the small tight set of her hand before she smoothed them away. I knelt. She curtsied low. I gave the royal couple a greeting pitched exactly humble enough, grateful for an honor far above a man of my years. The queen's gaze slid past me to Matilda, standing back at the respectful distance the room demanded, and her displeasure was plain without a word. She wanted to know why a baronet had brought a beastfolk companion into a hall this formal. She did not quite say it kindly. I kept my head down and my face still, and the king answered before I had to. He waved the objection off with an easy warmth, the warmth of a man who enjoys being generous where the whole room can see it. History was full of great men who were a little eccentric, he told her, and my work in the war was exactly the sort of eccentric he wanted more of. Then he said the thing that mattered, that the beastfolk were his subjects the same as anyone under his crown, and one of them was as welcome in his hall as any other guest in it. It landed on the hall like a small bell struck once. I have stood in rooms where Matilda was called a servant, a pet, a thing on a leash, and swallowed it because the moment wasn't mine to spend. I had promised myself I would build a place where no one got to say those words to her again. I never once imagined the man who'd say them for me would be the King of Redmark, out loud, in front of every noble who mattered, with his own wife on the wrong side of it. Matilda didn't move. She didn't need to. She stood there with her chin level and her hands quiet, a freed woman at her lord's back by her own choosing, and let the highest authority in the kingdom settle the question the way I never could have from where I stood. I didn't look at her. If I'd looked at her right, then I'd have shown the whole court something I keep for my own people only. The queen took the correction, the way you take a lesson from a husband who wears a crown. Her manner thawed a degree. She wished me continued success, and meant most of it. Then the king, in high humor, praised how young Clara was, and wished us a long and happy marriage. And Clara answered him softly, that her husband was always kind to her, and that she only tried to be a wife worthy of him. I let that stand too. It was more true than the room could know. We backed away from the dais, honored, defended, and sat exactly where I wanted to be, a little higher than a certain count from the southeast, in full view of him, with the crown's favor visibly resting on my shoulder and not on his. After that, Arnold walked me through the crowd like a guide through a menagerie, faction by faction, keeping every exchange light and pleasant, and skating well clear of anything with an edge. I shook hands until the faces blurred. He had briefed me on all of them, and I still lost half the names inside a minute, and I told him so, and we stole a moment near the wall to breathe. I asked him why Count Marcus, of all people, was in such an unusually cheerful mood tonight. I'd caught the man actually laughing when he greeted the king, which I'd have bet money he wasn't capable of. Arnold explained it low. Marcus came from an old military house that hadn't had a real war to its name in generations, only skirmishes and monster hunts. And the court had taken to calling him the undefeated knight, the way you'd call a man brave for never having been tested. This war had finally handed him the thing his whole bloodline was hungry for. Arnold shook his head over it. "A sorry state of affairs," he murmured, "when the men who spend years mocking warriors are the first to hide behind them the moment the enemy comes." I filed that away too. Half of what I did in rooms like this was file things away. Then Arnold's eyes moved across the floor and stopped, and his voice dropped another notch. "There," he said, "Count Maximilian of Vance." I followed the line of his look to the man I had already been aware of the entire night. The way you stay aware of a fire in the corner of a room. My father, older than the picture I carried, richly dressed, standing stiff among the southeast nobles, with a harried edge to him that the coat couldn't hide. I said I thought I ought to go pay my respects. A great and storied lord like the Count of Vance, it would be rude not to. Arnold heard exactly what I meant under it, and I watched him decide whether to stop me. He warned me, quietly, to keep my head. I promised him I would, and I meant it in my way. I had no intention of losing my composure. I was rather looking forward to keeping it. I only wondered, as I turned toward my father, whether he'd manage to keep his. My father was already sweating the night before I ever reached him. I could read it from 10 feet off. Every whisper drifting past him tonight carried the same news I'd made sure would travel, that the great Vance house was thinning at the edges, its finest craftsmen packed up and gone north, its coffers running behind its name. He stood there trading small nothings with an acquaintance, telling the man the road up from the capital had left him tired, and the tiredness was a lie stretched over something much closer to fear. I had put a good deal of that fear there myself, one fled artisan and one lost contract at a time. It was pleasant to watch it wear him. A young man came bustling up to him before I arrived, soft-faced, well-kept, 16, and glowing with the importance of it. Julian, my father's legitimate son, his heir. The boy announced, proud as a puppy, that he was making all sorts of friends among the young court nobles, and my father managed something like warmth for him and asked if he was enjoying himself. So this was the son he kept. Arnold made the introduction, smooth as glass. His youngest daughter had married the year before, he said, and would the Count allow him to present her husband, a man who'd earned real merit in the late war and been honored by His Majesty himself, Baronet Adrian of Ashford. I bowed to my father at precisely the depth his rank required, not a finger's width more. It was an honor, I told him, to meet the lord of so old and storied a territory. He returned it through his teeth. He said something dismissive about my lands, a rustic little holding, he'd heard, all trees and mud. I agreed pleasantly that it had certainly started as trees and mud. I let a small silence do the rest of the sentence for me, the one that ended with, and now its bluestone sells as far as the southern republics, while your craftsmen ride north to work for me. I didn't say it. I didn't have to. He knew the shape of it, and knowing it, standing there unable to answer it, was the whole point. Then he did the thing I'd been waiting for. He gathered up what dignity he had left and introduced the boy at his side. This was his heir, Julian, come of age just last year. He'd thought to bring him out into society. His heir, his firstborn, the introduction said, without saying it. I turned the full warmth of my attention on Julian, and I let it pour. Then I am honored twice over, I said. I have heard a great deal about the eldest hope of the Vance house, that he is a young lord brilliant enough to carry the future of this kingdom on his shoulders, that while he was still half a boy, he rode out on his first campaign and came back with his courage proven for all to see. They say the whole north speaks of the true firstborn son of Vance. It is no small thing to meet him at last. Every word of it was mine. I had held a fort against an army with almost no one at my back. I was the one the king had just honored in front of this entire hall. I was the eldest son of the House of Vance, the real one, the firstborn my father had caged and thrown away, and I stood in a room full of nobles and described myself out loud while pretending to praise the boy who'd replaced me. Julian never felt the blade go in. He lit up like a lantern. He ducked his head, bashful and delighted, and stumbled out a happy little laugh, and told me he was Julian of Vance, and please would I remember him. He thought every word was about him. That was the mercy in it, and the cruelty. My father understood perfectly. I watched it reach him, watched him do the arithmetic the whole court would now be doing right along with him. Eldest son, firstborn. The words hung in the air with a baronet attached to them, and a 16-year-old boy, who plainly wasn't the one being described. Somewhere at his shoulder, his acquaintance caught the joke and choked it down into a cough. Arnold turned a laugh into a small, polite clearing of his throat. My father's face went stiff and bloodless, the color of a man who has just felt the floor tilt under a secret he'd kept hidden for years. He could not correct me. That was the beauty of the whole thing. To untangle the barb, he'd have had to stand up in the king's own hall and announce that yes, in fact, there was an elder son of Vance, a real firstborn, and that he had shut him in a shed and dumped him on cursed land to die. Every road out of the trap ran straight through his own crime, so he could only stand there and swallow it, the way I had once swallowed everything, and choke on the taste. He cut the conversation short. Of course he did. He had run out of ways to be in it. I gave him a warm, unhurried farewell, thanked young Julian again for the pleasure, and turned away with a cheerful expression and Matilda falling in at my side. Behind me, I heard the boy start to say something, that the low-blooded baronet seemed a decent sort after all, maybe not so bad, and I heard my father cut him off. 2 hard words, quiet and vicious, telling him to be quiet. I didn't look back. I was smiling, and it was a real one, and I kept it for the walk across the floor. I hadn't touched him. I hadn't raised my voice or said a single word a witness could repeat against me. I had simply stood in the light the king had put me in and let my father look at everything he threw away. It wasn't finished, not nearly. A needle isn't a reckoning, and a man that cornered doesn't sit still, he claws. I could feel him already turning behind me toward whatever desperate doomed thing a sinking house reaches for when the son it threw away turns up in the king's own hall wearing the crown's favor. Let him reach. I had one move left, and it was the one that ended it, but not tonight. Tonight, I'd only wanted him to see. Arnold nearly sent his wine across the table. I had only just started the story, how the Count's boy had beamed like a lit lantern while I stood in front of the whole southeast corner of the hall and praised him to the rafters. And the Viscount was already coughing into his cup, thumping his own chest, one hand up begging me to stop before I finished him off. "Don't tell it like that," he wheezed. "You'll have me choke and die in my own house, and then where will the family be?" Eleanor had missed the banquet floor and refused to miss the story. She wanted the whole thing from the top, so I gave it to her slower and watched the table come apart laughing a second time. I laid out the shape of it, the Count of Vance presenting his heir to the room, proud as a man showing off a prize horse. Me praising that heir to the sky, his promise, his brilliance, the great hope of the ancient house of Vance, every word of it cut and fitted so that it also described the son the Count had thrown away, the boy soaking it up, delighted, thanking me for the kindness, and the father going the color of old ash beside him, unable to correct a single syllable without standing up in front of his peers and confessing exactly what he had done to his own firstborn. Even Matilda turned her face toward the dark window. From the side, I could see the corner of her mouth working, losing the fight, and that was worth more to me than all the laughter in the room. Clara laughed with the rest of them. Then the worry crept back into her, the way it always did, and she set her hand down near mine on the table. "Was it truly safe?" she asked quietly. "To bait the Count of Vance that hard? A great house, an old name, a man with every reason in the world to hate him." I told her it was already handled. Before I ever set foot in that hall, I had given the crown the crossbows, the designs, the means to make them in numbers, the harvest that could feed an army through a whole winter of siege. I had not given any of it for nothing. The price was set long before the banquet, and it was not paid in gold. She didn't understand yet. She would in 2 days. I only told her to trust that I never walked into a room until I had already quietly shut every door out of it. Later, in our room, I was still laughing. Not out loud anymore, just this thing sitting warm behind my ribs that would not settle. I sat on the edge of the bed and let it stay there. 9 years I had carried the other feeling, the cold one, the heavy one. It felt strange to set it down for a night and hold this instead. "I never thought I'd see the day I laughed this hard," I said, mostly to the candle. "It's a milestone, a real one." Matilda was near the door where she always put herself, close enough to reach me, far enough to watch the room. I told her the truth I'd been chewing on all evening, that the Count's twisted, bloodless face, when the barb landed, had been a masterpiece. Nothing in any gallery came close. "Yes, Lord Adrian," she said, and then, softer, more than she usually gave. The Count of Vance's twisted face had been nothing at all like the lofty way he used to carry himself back in the mansion, back when she and I were things kept in that house, and he was the great man who never once had to look at us. She remembered it too. That was the part that mattered. We had stood in the same cold rooms and been counted as the same kind of nothing, and now we stood here, and the great man was the one shaking. Clara watched the two of us from across the small, warm circle of the candle. She didn't say much, but I caught the look on her face, a quiet, private happiness at seeing her husband and her dearest friend joined together in something, even something with a shadow this long behind it. She knew what the joy was made of. She let us have it anyway. I put out the candle. For one night, I did not think about what came next. I already knew what came next. I had built it myself. I didn't have to be under that roof to know how the night went there. Some of it came back to me later, the way these things always do. A servant talks, a servant's cousin talks. The rest I could guess close enough, because I had lived in that house long enough to know exactly how my father broke things. He came home in a fury and took it out on the boy first. Shouted Julian hollow. Did the fool understand he'd been made a joke of, in front of every house that mattered, by that woman's cast-off child? A vase went into the wall and shattered. Aimed wide, though. Even raging, my father never spent anything he might miss. He threw to frighten, not to lose the vase. Julian wept and begged and pressed his face to the floor, and eventually, the count ran out of breath and waved him off with a sigh. The way you wave off a dog, you can't be bothered to kick twice. Then, Delia went to work on both of them. My stepmother had a tongue that could take skin off. That night, she turned it on her husband as much as her son. A count, she sneered. A great Count of Vance, come crawling home after being toyed with by a lowborn woman's leavings, and sitting there taking it. She would not have the family name dragged through the gutter and simply left there. She wanted an answer. She wanted me to pay, and my father, God help him, tried to find a way. He sat up half that night, looking for the seam in me, squeeze the territory, lean on my trade, get at my people, at Matilda. But every road he walked ran straight into the same wall and stopped dead. The Northwest faction stood behind me now. The marriage tied me to Conley, and over all of it hung the king's plain favor, fresh from the honoring dinner. He had less than he pretended, and some cold part of him knew it. His craftsmen had already fled north to me. His coffers had gone thin behind the grand old name. The great house of Vance was a facade with the rooms behind it, emptying out one by one. He was a man reaching for a sword and finding the scabbard light. He just hadn't looked down yet to see how light. I was not in that room. I didn't need to be. I had set every piece on the board weeks before, and all that was left was for my father to walk in and find the board closed around him. The details came to me afterward, from the crown's own people, and they were better than anything I'd let myself imagine. 2 days after the banquet, the Count of Vance went to the royal castle for a routine report on trade. He talked to the young king about the Southern Republic, about the merchant houses, about deepening ties across the sea. He was good at that part. It was the one lever he had left, and he leaned on it. The king listened. Then, mild as anything, he gave the count a piece of advice, that a lord should tend his weaker people too, not only cosset his rich merchants. My father bowed his head and thanked his majesty for the deep wisdom, and privately thought the young king a boy playing at rule. He always did think he was the smartest man in any room he stood in. Then the king said there was one more matter, about his eldest son. My father, careful, said he assumed his majesty meant Julian, and began some pleasant nothing about the boy. Not that one, the king said. Your true eldest, the Baronet of Ashford, and I would have given a great deal to see his face right there. He caught himself fast, he always could, and said smoothly that he had cut ties with that one years ago and knew nothing of his affairs. The king only smiled and explained, at his leisure, exactly whose affairs they were. A knight raised to baronet in 3 short years. The mind behind the crossbow that had turned the war with Lancel. The man who had handed those designs to the crown, and more besides, asking little in return. Little, but not nothing. When his majesty had asked what reward the baronet wanted for arming the kingdom, the baronet had asked for one thing, protection, from the house of Vance, for his life, his body, his lands, and his people. Because, the king said plainly, the baronet feared that a jealous, resentful father might try to harm what he'd built, and the crown, having weighed the man's loyalty and his worth, did not intend to see a talent like that squandered in some petty family feud. I want you to sit with what that meant, landing on him, all at once. Here is the cold arithmetic he had to do, standing there under the tall windows, with the king watching him with faint amusement. The son he had shut in a shed for 6 years. The son he had dumped on cursed, monster-eaten land at 15 with no men and no coin, fully expecting the ground to eat him and spare the family the scandal. That son had not only lived, he had climbed so high that the crown itself now reached out a hand to shield him from his own father. And the king was not asking. A king does not ask. He was setting the terms and waiting to hear them agreed. For one moment, I let myself picture what moved behind my father's eyes. The slow understanding that he had been beaten completely by a boy he never once bothered to remember the face of. That every road he'd set up plotting 2 nights before was already walled off and had been for weeks before he even knew there was a game. That the taunt at the banquet had not been a boy's lucky insult, but a single move in a long, quiet campaign he had never been told he was losing. And under all of it, the thing I think actually broke him, that the one he threw out with the trash was now the one the world had decided to protect. And he was the danger it was being protected from. Then I stopped imagining him, because he did not get to keep the lens. He never did. He swore the oath. Of course he swore it, word for word, the vow the crown put in front of him, that he and all the House of Vance would bring no harm to the life, the body, the territory, or the property of Baronet Adrian of Ashford. He got the words out in his steady court voice, and every one of them was a nail he was driving into his own coffin, in front of his king with his own hand. And in case my father was already turning over some quieter way around it, a hired knife, an accident on a lonely road, a rumor let loose in the right ear, the king mentioned, lightly, almost in passing, how deep the crown's web of mages ran these days, how little happened in the kingdom that failed to reach the castle before long. He said it like a courtesy. It was a leash, and my father felt the collar close. The king thanked him, told him, kindly, not to sigh so. They lived at opposite ends of the kingdom, after all. Live quietly, His Majesty said. Tend your lands, enjoy your life, and you'll hardly remember the other man exists. But he would remember. We both knew he would remember every single day. He walked out of the castle alone, dismissed his escort at the gate, waved the worried knight off, told the man to take the carriage back without him. He wanted to walk, a Count of Vance, on foot through the capital streets like a merchant, because he could not stand to sit still in a box with someone watching his face. Somewhere on that walk, it all came clear to him, every step of it. The banquet, the praise, the crossbows he'd heard rumors of and never connected. All of it one shape, and the shape had been aimed at him from the start. From behind a shield, the crown had already bolted into place. He had been struck by a man he couldn't touch, and he had only learned there was a fist coming after it had already landed. He came home to a house that no longer stood behind him. Delia had gone cold and quiet. Her scorn hardened into something that no longer bothered to shout. Julian was a disappointment he couldn't even blame the boy for. His craftsmen were gone north, to me, and taking the last of the county's real worth with them. His coffers were thinning behind the name. His own faction had begun, very politely, to leave a little more space around him at the table. And so the great Count of Vance did the only thing left to a man who is lost and cannot admit it. He decided to stop. He would bury the hatred, he told himself. Put it down. There was no profit in it, and no safe road to it. So he would simply forget that the boy had ever existed, and pour himself into the comforts a lord of his rank still had. The good wine, the flattering company, the soft numbing round of a great man's days. He called it peace. It wasn't. It was a man sitting down in the ruins of his own house and closing his eyes so he wouldn't have to see the walls come down. A surrender dressed up in silk and told very firmly that it was a choice. He'd wanted, once, to be the kind of man other men feared. He ended as a man with nothing left to fear and no one left to fight, alone at the head of a long table, in a house going quiet, while the son he threw away to die stood honored and safe at the other end of the kingdom. That was the last I ever really needed from him. Not his death, just that, the sitting down. Weeks later, I stood on my own ground in Ashford, and I finally let myself put the whole thing down. I could have killed him. I want to be honest about that, because there was a version of me that wanted to. There is a streak in me, cold and patient, that I've watched carefully my whole life, because it is the one thing I inherited from that man, and the one thing I refused to become. It had a voice, and for 9 years, its answer was simple. Take the blade. Finish it. Make the ground eat him the way he tried to make it eat you. I chose the oath instead. 2 things were true at once, and I let both of them be true. Locking him in a cage of the king's own making, on the record, in front of his peers, and then leaving him to rot slowly in a house that was already dying around him. That was the just thing. It was also, by a long way, the crueler thing. A quick death would have let him off. This lets him live every remaining day of his fading life, knowing precisely who beat him, and being forbidden by his own sworn word to lift a hand about it. I wanted the justice. I wanted the cruelty too. I stopped pretending a long time ago that I was only ever the first kind of man. But here is the line I would not step over, and it is the whole difference between us. 9 years ago, he dug me a grave. He didn't call it that. He called it a grant of land, a scrap of cursed forest on the far edge of the map, monster-ridden, worth nothing, handed to a boy of 15 with no soldiers and no coin, and the plain, unspoken expectation that the dirt would close over me quietly and save the family its embarrassment. A grave with the earth already turned, waiting. He walked away, certain I would fill it. I didn't. I climbed out. I built a house on the very lip of the hole he'd dug for me, and then a wall, and then a village, and then a whole city full of people the world had also thrown away. A bandit who'd been used as kindling, a craftswoman he'd let go to ruin, beast folk nobody else would count as people, refugees, a doctor who wanted somewhere worth dying near. I did not spend a single one of them cheaply. That was the promise I made the first winter and never broke, and it is the exact promise he broke with me. I made my people worth more than firewood, and they made me a lord no oath was needed to keep loyal. And now, the man who buried me was the one sinking into the dark he'd meant for me, while I stood in the sun on land that was supposed to have killed me. Matilda was at my shoulder, where she has stood since we were both nothing in his house. Clara came across the grass with the ledger she actually enjoyed keeping, and further off the sounds of the city carried up. Roland's men drilling, Jonas's son among them building the future his father died believing in. Hammers, voices, a place that was alive. I had spent my whole life trying to prove I deserved to live. Standing there, I understood I didn't have to prove it to anyone anymore. The life was the proof. He could watch it from the far end of the kingdom, sworn to keep his hands off it, for as long as he lasted. There was more coming. There always is. A mage I'd need soon. More land, harder winters, the next thing after this thing. But that was tomorrow's ledger. Today I only stood in my own field, in the light he was certain I'd never see, and let the account close, paid in full.